Chapter 1. The Weight of Truth. Hermione lay in her four-poster bed, staring at the canopy above while her dorm mates slept soundly around her. The events of the night should have left her exhausted. The desperate flight through time, the frantic rescue of Sirius and Buckbeak, the impossible juggling of causality itself. But sleep felt as distant as the morning light creeping through the tower windows. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sirius's haunted face in the shrieking shack, heard the raw pain in his voice as he spoke of that terrible Halloween night 13 years ago. The time-turner sat heavy against her chest beneath her nightgown, its delicate gold chain warm from her skin. She had perhaps an hour before she needed to return it to Professor McGonagall, before the secret that had defined her entire third year came to an end. But the weight of it felt different now. Not just the burden of academic obligation, but something far more dangerous. Something that whispered of possibilities she had never dared consider. Dumbledore was there so quickly, Sirius had said, his voice brittle with old grief. Too quickly. I'd barely gotten Harry out of the ruins when Hagrid came thundering up on that bloody motorcycle, saying Dumbledore had sent him. But how did Dumbledore even know? We were under the Fidelius charm. The only people who should have known what happened were— He'd stopped then, his face going grey as the implications hit him. Peter. Peter had been the secret keeper. Peter had betrayed James and Lily. But there was something else in Sirius's expression, something that made Hermione's analytical mind catch like a gear grinding against stone. She turned onto her side, pulling her knees up toward her chest. The official story was simple. Voldemort had somehow discovered the Potters' location, murdered them, tried to kill baby Harry, and been destroyed by his own rebounded curse. Hagrid had arrived to find the house in ruins and had taken Harry to safety. Dumbledore had arranged for Harry to be placed with his aunt and uncle for his own protection. Clean, neat, logical. But Sirius's words kept echoing in her mind. Too quickly. He was there too quickly. Hermione had always prided herself on accepting logical explanations, on trusting authority figures who had earned that trust through demonstrated wisdom. Professor McGonagall had given her the time-turner because she believed in Hermione's judgment and responsibility. Dumbledore had orchestrated Harry's protection. He had fought against Voldemort for decades, had sacrificed so much for the greater good. And yet, the doubt was a splinter in her mind, sharp and persistent. How had Dumbledore known to send Hagrid? The Fidelius charm was supposed to be unbreakable except by the secret keeper's betrayal. If Peter had gone straight to Voldemort after the betrayal, when had anyone had time to alert the headmaster? The timeline felt wrong, compressed in a way that made her teeth ache with the same sensation she got when looking at a complex arithmancy equation that didn't quite balance. She sat up in bed, her bushy hair falling around her shoulders like a curtain. The dormitory was quiet, except for Lavender's gentle snoring and the occasional rustle of bedsheets. Everyone else could sleep soundly, as unburdened by the weight of temporal mechanics and the terrible clarity that came with too much knowledge. The time-turner pulsed against her skin, warm and beckoning. She could go back. The thought hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The ministry rules were clear, 5 hours maximum, and only for the most carefully authorized purposes. She had already pushed those boundaries tonight, had used the device for rescue rather than academic scheduling. Using it for this, would be a complete violation of every rule, every safeguard, every trust that had been placed in her. But she could see the truth. She could witness what really happened that night, could finally understand why Sirius's grief felt so much deeper than simple loss, why his anger toward Peter carried undercurrents of something else, something that felt almost like betrayal by more than just one person. Hermione's fingers closed around the time-turner, feeling its delicate mechanisms through the gold casing. Professor McGonagall trusted her. The ministry had made exceptions to their regulations based on her academic record and demonstrated responsibility. She had sworn oaths signed documents, promised to use the device only for approved purposes. Going back to 1981 would shatter every one of those promises. The rational part of her mind, the part that had always served her so well, laid out the arguments with mathematical precision. The temporal displacement would be unprecedented, dangerous beyond measure. 12 years and 8 months. The calculations alone made her head spin. She could be stranded, could fracture time itself, could create paradoxes that would unravel reality. The time turner was designed for minor adjustments, not archaeological expeditions into the darkest moments of recent history. And even if she survived the journey, what then? She knew how the night ended. She couldn't change it without destroying everything that had come after. Harry's survival, Voldemort's defeat, her own existence as she knew it, all of it balanced on the terrible foundation of James and Lily Potter's deaths. To interfere would be to condemn the world for the sake of satisfying her curiosity. But it wasn't just curiosity anymore, was it? The doubt had grown into something larger, something that felt like moral obligation. If Dumbledore had known what was going to happen, if he had chosen not to prevent it. Hermione's breath caught in her throat. The thought was almost blasphemous. Dumbledore was the greatest wizard of their age, the man who had sacrificed everything to protect people like her and Harry. He had fought Grindelwald, had opposed Voldemort, had built a network of resistance that had saved countless lives. The idea that he might have allowed the Potters to die for some greater purpose was exactly the kind of decision that the greater good sometimes required. The realization hit her like ice water. Dumbledore had always spoken of difficult choices, of the burden that came with power and knowledge. What if the night of October 31st, 1981, had been one of those choices? What if allowing Voldemort to attack the Potters had been the only way to ensure the Dark Lord's eventual defeat? The greater good. How often had she heard those words? How readily had she accepted them as justification for secrecy and manipulation? But Harry deserved to know. Harry, who had been placed with relatives who despised him, who had grown up, abused and unloved, who had faced Voldemort again and again, without understanding why his parents had really died. Hermione's fingers tightened on the time turner until the metal edges pressed into her palm. She thought of Harry's face when he spoke about his parents, the way he treasured every scrap of information about James and Lily. She thought of Sirius, broken by 13 years in Azkaban for a crime he didn't commit while the real traitor walked free. She thought of all the lies wrapped in good intentions, all the half-truths designed to protect people from knowledge that might set them free, or the decision crystallized in her mind with the clarity of a perfect arithmancy solution. She would go back. She would witness the truth of that night, whatever it might be. And if she found evidence that Harry had been betrayed by more than just Peter Pettigrew, if she discovered that the man they all trusted had orchestrated the very tragedy that defined Harry's life, then she would find a way to expose it. Even if it destroyed everything she thought she knew about the world. Hermione slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She dressed quickly in the darkness, pulling on robes and shoes with practiced efficiency. The castle was quiet around her, most of its inhabitants lost in dreams of summer holidays and freedom from exams. She envied them their ignorance, their ability to sleep without questioning the foundations of everything they believed. But envy was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The time turner seemed to pulse with anticipation as she made her way toward an unused classroom where she could work without interruption. Her mind was already calculating the precise number of rotations needed, the temporal mathematics that would carry her back through more than a decade of time to witness the moment that had shaped everything that followed, to witness the truth about the night Harry's parents died, and about the man who might have let it happen. The golden device caught the first rays of dawn light as she lifted it from around her neck, its surface gleaming with promise and peril in equal measure. In a few moments, she would either find confirmation of her darkest suspicions or discover that her fears were groundless paranoia. Either way, Nothing would ever be the same. Hermione began to turn the time-turner, counting each rotation with the precision of someone who had already crossed the line between wisdom and dangerous curiosity. The world began to blur around her as time itself bent to her will, carrying her back toward a Halloween night that had changed everything, and toward truths that some secrets were meant to bury forever. Chapter 2. Beyond the 5-hour rule. The abandoned classroom on the 3rd floor felt different in the pre-dawn hours, shadows stretching across dusty desks like accusatory fingers. Hermione closed the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence, then cast a series of privacy charms with methodical precision. Muffliato, imperturbable, protean silencing ward. Each spell layered protection around her transgression, brought her the solitude she needed to shatter every rule she had sworn to uphold. She set the time-turner on the nearest desk, its gold surface catching the wan light filtering through grimy windows. The device looked so innocent in the gloom, elegant, delicate, perfectly mundane. Nothing about its appearance suggested it could tear holes in the fabric of time itself, could carry a desperate 17-year-old girl back through more than a decade of history to witness truths that had been buried in official silence. Hermione pulled out parchment and quill, her hand steady, despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Mathematics had always been her refuge in moments of uncertainty, the clean logic of numbers and equations offering clarity when emotion threatened to overwhelm rational thought. If she was going to attempt something this monumentally dangerous, she would at least do it properly. The calculations spread across the parchment in neat rows, her familiar handwriting cataloguing the impossible. October 31st, 1981 to June 15th, 1994. 12 years, 7 months, and 15 days. She converted it all to hours, accounting for leap years and the precise time differential. The number that emerged made her throat go dry. 112,704 hours. 112,704 individual rotations of the time-turner's delicate mechanism. The ministry guidelines were explicit, 5 hours maximum, and even that carried risks. What she was proposing would shatter those limitations by a factor of more than 22,000. The magical stress alone should kill her outright. The temporal displacement should tear her atoms apart and scatter them across the decades like dust on the wind. But the time-turner had been created by minds far more brilliant than the bureaucrats who had written the safety regulations. Ancient magic ran through its mechanisms, spells woven by artisans who had understood the true nature of time itself. The 5-hour limit existed not because the device couldn't handle more, but because human beings weren't designed to experience the temporal forces required for longer journeys. Hermione had always excelled at pushing beyond what others considered possible. She lifted the time-turner from the desk, feeling its weight settle into her palm. The device seemed to thrum with anticipation. Or perhaps that was just her imagination, overlaying patterns onto the natural variations in the magical field surrounding it. Either way, the sensation felt like recognition, as if the ancient magic within recognized her determination and approved of her transgression. The first rotation came easily, the familiar sensation of time bending around her. She had done this hundreds of times over the course of 3rd year, quick adjustments to attend multiple classes or squeeze extra study hours from an already overpacked schedule. The mechanism turned smoothly, clicking with mechanical precision. 1 hour back. 112,703 to go. By the 10th rotation, her fingers were beginning to ache. By the 100th, sweat was beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. The time-turner was growing warm in her hands, the metal almost uncomfortably hot against her skin. She could feel the device straining against its intended limits, magic crackling along the delicate chain with increasing intensity. The 1000th turn brought the first real warning. The time-turner lurched in her grasp, its smooth rotation stuttering as if the mechanism itself was fighting against her demands. Sparks of golden light began to dance along its surface, tiny arcs of temporal energy that made her teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges. The classroom around her seemed to shift and waver, reality becoming uncertain as the accumulated temporal stress began to affect the present moment. Hermione gritted her teeth and continued turning, but the mathematics were clear. She needed all 112,704 rotations, not a single one less. Half measures would leave her stranded in some random moment of history, potentially decades away from her target. If she was going to commit this particular blasphemy against the natural order, she would do it completely. At 5,000 rotations, the time-turner began to smoke. Thin wisps of something that looked like steam, but smelled of ozone and burnt copper rose from its surface, carrying with them the acrid taste of magic pushed far beyond its intended boundaries. The device was no longer warm. It was genuinely hot now, hot enough to raise blisters on her palms, but she couldn't stop, couldn't pause to cool it or give it time to recover. The temporal momentum she was building required constant pressure, the unrelenting force applied against the barriers between past and present. 10,000 rotations. The smoking intensified, and the golden light dancing across the time-turner's surface had deepened to an ominous amber. Hairline cracks were beginning to appear in the metal, stress fractures that spread like spider webs across the device's elegant surface. The chain had grown so hot it was burning against her neck, leaving red welts on her skin that would probably scar. But scars were a small price for truth. 20,000. The world around her was becoming increasingly unstable, walls shifting like mirages in the desert heat. She could see through the stone sometimes, glimpses of other moments bleeding through. Students from decades past attending classes in this very room, dust motes dancing in long faded sunlight. The temporal barriers were breaking down under the sustained assault, allowing fragments of different times to overlap and interfere with each other. 50,000 rotations. Hermione was no longer entirely certain she existed in any single moment. Her body felt stretched, pulled thin across multiple points in time simultaneously. She could see herself as a child, reading beneath the covers by wandlight. She could see herself as an old woman, hair white and hands gnarled with arthritis. All of these possibilities existed at once, superimposed like multiple exposures on the same piece of magical photography. The time-turner was screaming now, a high-pitched whine that spoke of metal and magic pushed far beyond their breaking points. The cracks had spread across its entire surface, and molten gold was beginning to leak from the stress fractures. But the mechanism still turned, still clicked with each rotation, still bent time to her desperate will. 75,000. The classroom disappeared entirely, reality dissolving into a kaleidoscope of temporal fragments. Hermione was falling through time itself now, plummeting backward through years and decades, while the damaged time-turner burned against her palms like a piece of the sun. She could see the history of Hogwarts rushing past her in reverse, students growing younger, buildings changing and shifting, seasons cycling backward in dizzying succession. 100,000 rotations. The time-turner finally gave up its structural integrity entirely, metal flowing like water as the ancient magic within fought to contain forces that should have been impossible. But it was still turning, still functioning, held together now by nothing more than Hermione's determination and the raw will to witness truth. 112,704. The final rotation. Reality exploded. The temporal shockwave hit her like a physical blow, slamming her backward through the collapsing barriers between past and present. The ruined time-turner fell from her nerveless fingers, its molten metal cooling rapidly in the sudden absence of temporal stress. The world around her was a riot of sensation. Colors that had no names, sounds that existed in frequencies human ears had never been designed to hear, forces that pulled at her very soul with the weight of decades. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. Hermione found herself lying on grass, real grass beneath a real sky that held the deep purple of early evening, as the air smelled different, cleaner somehow, less touched by the accumulated pollution of industrial progress. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, pinpricks of light in a sky that seemed somehow more vivid than any she remembered from her own time. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the world spun around her like a child's top. The temporal displacement had taken its toll on her body as well as her magic. Her skin felt raw, as if she had been scrubbed with sandpaper. Her magic felt different, too, thin and stretched, like a muscle that had been exercised far beyond its limits. Every breath tasted of copper and ozone, the lingering after-effects of forces no human being had ever been designed to survive. But she was alive. Against all probability and reason, she had survived the journey. Hermione forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly as the last echoes of temporal displacement worked their way through her nervous system. The landscape around her was familiar, yet strange. Godric's Hollow, but as it had existed more than 13 years ago. The trees were smaller, the houses subtly different in ways she couldn't quite define. Even the quality of the light seemed somehow more innocent, as if the world itself was younger and less scarred by the wars that were yet to come. In the distance, she could see the Potter home. Warm light spilled from its windows, and she could just make out the shadow of figures moving within. James and Lily Potter, alive and unknowing, sharing their last evening together before the world changed forever. Hermione looked down at her hands and felt her heart sink. For the time-turner was completely ruined, its elegant mechanisms fused into an unrecognizable mass of twisted metal. The chain had snapped during the journey, leaving angry red burns around her neck where the superheated links had pressed against her skin. Whatever forces had carried her back through time, they had consumed the device that had made the journey possible. She was stranded. Stranded in 1981, with no way home, no way to undo what she had done. The magnitude of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She had traded her entire future for the chance to witness one terrible night, had burned every bridge behind her in pursuit of truth that might destroy everything she thought she knew about the world. But as the first stars emerged in the darkening sky above Godric's Hollow, Hermione felt no regret. Only determination, or cold and hard as winter steel. She had come this far, had sacrificed this much. She would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. The truth was waiting for her somewhere in the shadows of this October night, and she would find it, no matter the cost. Behind her, the twisted remains of the time-turner glowed faintly in the gathering darkness, the last echoes of ancient magic slowly fading into silence. There would be no going back now. There was only forward, into the heart of the mystery that had brought her across more than a decade of time to stand witness to the moment that had shaped everything that followed. The night Harry's parents would die. The night that would change the world. The night she would finally learn the truth about Albus Dumbledore. Chapter 3. October. Shadows. The woods outside Godric's Hollow held the crisp stillness of late October, autumn leaves crunching beneath Hermione's feet as she picked her way carefully between the trees. The temporal displacement had left her disoriented, but the familiar rhythm of walking helped ground her in this strange new reality where everything felt simultaneously foreign and achingly familiar. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, tinged with the particular quality of magic that seemed to permeate every inch of the wizarding village. She paused at the edge of the tree line, her breath catching in her throat as she got her first clear view of the Potter home. It looked exactly as she had imagined it from Harry's descriptions, yet seeing it whole and undamaged sent a shock through her system that she hadn't been prepared for. Warm golden light spilled from every window, painting rectangles of warmth across the small garden where a child's toys lay scattered in the grass. A toy broomstick, she realized with a pang of recognition. Harry's first broomstick, the one he would never have the chance to outgrow. The house radiated the kind of domestic tranquility that belonged in fairy tales, not in the last hours before one of the darkest moments in wizarding history. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and she could see movement through the kitchen window, a flash of red hair that had to be Lily, moving with the efficient grace of someone preparing an evening meal. The normalcy of it was almost obscene, considering what was coming. Hermione's legs felt unsteady beneath her, the combined effects of temporal displacement and emotional shock threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She needed to find a proper observation post, somewhere she could watch without being detected. But first, she needed to ensure she wouldn't be seen by anyone else who might be lurking in the growing dusk. She pulled her wand from her robes with fingers that trembled only slightly, grateful that the familiar weight of the wood felt unchanged despite her journey through time. The disillusionment charm came easily to her lips, the incantation flowing with the same precision she had used countless times during her unauthorized research expeditions in the Hogwarts library. The sensation of the charm settling over her was like being dipped in cold paint, or magic flowing across her skin until she became nothing more than a shimmer in the air. Additional concealment spells followed in quick succession. Notice me not charms, scent masking enchantments, even a modified version of the silencing charm that would muffle any inadvertent sounds she might make. By the time she was finished, she was virtually invisible to both magical and mundane detection methods. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was using the same techniques she had perfected for academic rule-breaking to witness the greatest tragedy of her generation. Moving with careful deliberation, Hermione found a position behind a massive oak tree that provided clear sightlines to the Potter home while keeping her safely hidden in shadow. The angle was perfect, was allowing her to see into several of the ground floor windows while remaining concealed from anyone approaching the house from the village proper. She settled herself against the tree trunk, ignoring the way the rough bark dug into her back through her robes, and focused all her attention on the tableau unfolding before her. Through the kitchen window, she could see Lily Potter moving between the stove and counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had cooked this same meal dozens of times before. She was beautiful in a way that photographs had never quite captured, not the ethereal beauty of a memorial portrait, but the warm, lived-in beauty of a young mother at the end of a long day. Her red hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she hummed softly as she worked, completely unaware that she had less than 30 minutes left to live. The living room window offered a different view, one that made Hermione's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. James Potter sat in an armchair near the fireplace, the Daily Prophet spread across his lap, his dark hair falling across his forehead in the same unruly way that Harry's always did. But it was the small form curled up against his chest that truly stole her breath. Baby Harry, no more than 15 months old, dozed peacefully against his father's shirt, while James read the evening news in the soft light of the fire. The scene was so perfectly, heart-breakingly domestic that Hermione had to bite her lip to keep from making a sound. This was what Harry had lost. Not just parents who died heroically defending him, but parents who had lived, who had shared quiet evenings and family meals, and all the countless small moments that made up a life together. Parents who had held him and read to him and loved him with the fierce protectiveness that radiated from every line of their bodies, even across the years and through the glass that separated them. Movement caught her eye, and she watched as James shifted Harry carefully to one arm while turning a page of the Prophet. The baby stirred but didn't wake, making the kind of soft sounds that all infants made when they were completely secure in their parents' love. James's face was soft with the particular tenderness that fathers reserved for sleeping children, and he pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Harry's head before settling back to continue reading. They had no idea. The thought hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over behind the tree trunk as the full weight of what she was witnessing crashed down upon her. James and Lily Potter were spending their last evening together in perfect ignorance of what was coming. They were making dinner and reading the newspaper and cherishing their baby son, completely unaware that Voldemort was already moving through the night toward their door. The temptation to warn them rose in her throat like bile, so powerful it made her hands shake. She could step out of concealment right now, could march up to their front door and tell them to run. She could explain about Pettigrew's betrayal, could give them the crucial minutes they would need to escape before Voldemort arrived. The knowledge burned in her chest, begging to be shared, demanding action. But she couldn't. The closed-loop principle that governed time travel was absolute. She could not change what she knew had already happened without risking paradoxes that could unravel reality itself. Harry's survival, Voldemort's temporary defeat, even her own existence depended on this night playing out exactly as history recorded it. To interfere would be to condemn the entire world for the sake of saving two people, no matter how desperately she wanted to save them. The logical part of her mind understood this with perfect clarity. The emotional part of her, the part that was still 17 years old and had grown up loving Harry like a brother, wanted to scream until her throat bled. Instead, she forced herself to remain still, to watch and remember every detail. If she had sacrificed everything to witness this night, then she would honor that sacrifice by bearing witness properly. She would see what Dumbledore had done or failed to do, would carry that truth back to her own time somehow, would make sure that Harry finally understood the full story of his parents' deaths. A new sound drew her attention back to the house. Lily's voice, calling something to James that she couldn't quite make out through the glass. James laughed in response, a warm sound that carried clearly in the still air, and Hermione watched him rise carefully from his chair, with Harry still sleeping against his chest. He moved toward the kitchen, and for a moment, the three of them were framed together in the doorway between the rooms, a family portrait painted in golden lamplight, beautiful and terrible in its doomed perfection. Lily reached up to smooth James's hair, the gesture so casually intimate that it spoke of years of shared mornings and countless small touches. She said something else, and James grinned before leaning down to kiss her. Even from her position across the garden, Hermione could see the love that passed between them, not the desperate passion of young romance, but the deep, settled affection of two people who had chosen each other and built a life together. Harry stirred in his father's arms, and Lily immediately turned her attention to him, stroking his fine dark hair with infinite gentleness. The baby's eyes opened, impossibly green even from this distance, and he reached up toward his mother with the uncoordinated movements of infancy. Lily took him from James, holding him close while she swayed gently back and forth in the unconscious rhythm that all mothers seem to learn. This was Harry's last memory of his parents, not the terror and violence of Voldemort's attack, but this moment of perfect love and safety. He would never remember it consciously, would never be able to call up the image of his mother's face as she held him, or the sound of his father's laughter echoing through their home. But somewhere deep in his soul, this feeling would remain, the knowledge that he had been utterly, completely loved. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it only made the coming tragedy feel more brutal, more senseless. In 20 minutes, this scene of domestic bliss would become a horror that would haunt the wizarding world for years to come. In 20 minutes, these loving parents would be dead, and their baby son would be left with nothing but a lightning bolt scar and a lifetime of questions that no one had ever been willing to answer honestly. Hermione settled more firmly against the tree trunk, ignoring the way the autumn air was beginning to seep through her robes. The wait was going to be the hardest part, sitting here in enforced silence while she watched the final chapter of the Potters' lives play out in excruciating slow motion. But she had come too far and sacrificed too much to lose her nerve now. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Albus Dumbledore was already moving into position for his own vigil. Soon she would have her answers about what he had known and when he had known it. Or soon she would understand why the most powerful wizard of the age had failed to prevent a tragedy he should have been able to stop. But for now, there was nothing to do but watch and remember. To bear witness to the last moments of happiness that Harry Potter's parents would ever share, and to carry the weight of that knowledge forward into whatever came next. The shadows were growing longer, and night was falling over Godric's Hollow. In the house across the garden, the Potter family continued their quiet evening, unaware that their time was measured now in minutes rather than years. And in the woods beyond, Hermione Granger held her vigil, prepared to learn truths that would change everything she thought she knew about the war that had shaped her world. The night was just beginning, and already it felt like the longest of her life. Now, Chapter 4. The Headmaster's Vigil. The movement was so subtle that Hermione almost missed it, a shift in the shadows beyond the Potter home that could have been nothing more than wind stirring the autumn branches. But her eyes had been trained by years of careful observation, honed by countless hours spent watching for professors during unauthorized excursions through Hogwarts corridors. The pattern was wrong, the shadow too deliberate in its stillness to be natural. Someone else was watching the house. Hermione's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself more firmly against the oak tree's rough bark, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away her position. The concealment spells she had woven around herself suddenly felt inadequate, a gossamer thin protection against discovery by whatever other observer had chosen this night for their own vigil. She forced herself to remain perfectly still, scanning the tree line with the methodical precision she applied to everything else in her life. There, roughly 30 yards to her left, positioned behind a cluster of silver birch trees that provided excellent coverage while maintaining clear sight lines to the Potter home. The figure was expertly concealed, but now that she knew where to look, she could make out the subtle signs of human presence. A vertical line that was too straight to be natural, the absence of undergrowth where feet would need to be planted for optimal viewing. Professional surveillance. Whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. The implications sent ice water through her veins. Nor if there was another watcher, someone else who had come to observe this particular night, then perhaps her growing suspicions about the official story weren't as paranoid as she had hoped. Perhaps someone else knew what was going to happen here, knew enough to position themselves as a witness to events that should have been impossible to predict. Hermione drew her wand with infinite care, the familiar weight of the wood somehow comforting despite the way her hands trembled with a combination of temporal displacement, aftershocks, and raw terror. She layered additional concealment charms over herself, subtler variations that would hide her magical signature as well as her physical presence. The magic felt thin and strained after her journey through time, but it held, wrapping around her like a second skin of shadows and misdirection. Now, moving with the patience that had served her well during 3 years of academic espionage, she began to work her way through the underbrush toward the other watcher's position. Each step was placed with deliberate care, her weight distributed to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The techniques she had learned during their investigation of the polyjuice potion ingredients served her well now, urban stealth adapted for woodland surveillance. As she drew closer, more details became visible. The figure was tall, certainly male, wearing dark robes that helped him blend into the evening shadows. He stood with the kind of perfect stillness that spoke of long practice, someone accustomed to waiting and watching without fidgeting or betraying his presence through nervous movement. Every few minutes, he would shift his position slightly, not restlessness, but the methodical adjustments of someone maintaining optimal observation angles. Professional, experienced, dangerous. Hermione was close enough now to make out specific features, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins. The long silver beard was unmistakable even in the gathering darkness, as distinctive as a signature written across the twilight. The half-moon spectacles caught what little light remained, glinting with an intelligence that had guided the wizarding world through its darkest hours, Albus Dumbledore stood in perfect silence behind the birch trees, his attention fixed unwaveringly on the Potter home, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was waiting for something specific to happen. The shock of recognition hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her dizzy with the implications of what she was witnessing. Dumbledore was here. Here, now, before Voldemort's arrival, positioned like a theatre patron, waiting for the curtain to rise on a performance he had paid to see. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had been alerted after the fact, someone who had rushed to the scene upon receiving word of an attack. This was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what was coming and when it would arrive, someone who had come to observe rather than prevent. Hermione's knees nearly buckled as the full weight of what she was seeing crashed down upon her. All her careful reasoning, all her logical analysis of timeline inconsistencies, all her growing suspicions about the official story, none of it had prepared her for this moment of absolute confirmation. The greatest wizard of the age, the man who had dedicated his life to fighting dark magic, was calmly waiting to watch James and Lily Potter die. She forced herself to remain motionless, to think rather than react, to observe rather than flee or confront. If she was going to bear witness to this atrocity, she would do it properly. She would gather every detail, would miss nothing that might help her understand the full scope of what was happening here. Dumbledore's position was carefully chosen, close enough to see everything that would happen at the house, but far enough away to avoid being caught in any magical backlash from Voldemort's attack. The angle provided him with clear views of both the front door and the main windows, ensuring he would miss none of the evening's events. It was the positioning of someone who had planned this observation in advance, who had scouted the location and chosen his vantage point with strategic precision. As she watched, Dumbledore reached into his robes and withdrew something that caught the fading light, a pocket watch, gold and elegant in the way that spoke of both age and significant magical enhancement. He opened it with a practiced gesture, studying its face with the kind of attention one gave to crucial timing information. When he closed it again and returned it to his robes, his expression carried the particular satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly on schedule. The gesture was so casual, though so routine, that it suggested this wasn't the first time he had checked the timing of these events. This wasn't anxious uncertainty about when something might happen. This was the methodical monitoring of a timeline he understood in precise detail. Hermione felt something cold and terrible settling in her chest, a leaden weight that spoke of innocence dying in real time. Every hero needs to fall sometime, her rational mind observed with detached clarity. Every child eventually learns that the adults they trusted were just as flawed and fallible as everyone else. But this wasn't garden-variety human failure. This was something far more sinister, a betrayal so fundamental that it called into question everything she thought she understood about the war that had shaped her world. How long had he known? Or the question burned in her mind as she watched the headmaster's serene vigil. How long had Albus Dumbledore known that Voldemort would come to Godric's Hollow on this particular night, at this particular time, to murder Harry Potter's parents? Days? Weeks? Months? And if he had known, if he had possessed the power to prevent it, why hadn't he acted? The answer that suggested itself was too terrible to contemplate directly, but it lurked at the edges of her consciousness like a predator waiting to pounce. The greater good. Dumbledore's favourite phrase, his justification for so many difficult decisions over the years. What if allowing James and Lily to die had been necessary for some larger victory? What if their sacrifice had been calculated, deliberate, orchestrated to serve purposes that only the headmaster understood? Or what if everything she thought she knew about Harry's story, the tragic orphan saved by love's protection, the boy who lived by miraculous chance, was actually the result of careful manipulation by the very man who claimed to be protecting him? Movement in the house drew her attention back to the domestic scene playing out in warm lamplight. Through the kitchen window, she could see Lily ladling what looked like soup into bowls, her movements graceful and unconscious with the familiarity of routine. James had joined her in the kitchen, still carrying Harry, and the three of them formed a perfect tableau of family contentment. They were talking about something, their expressions animated with the kind of comfortable banter that spoke of years of shared meals and easy conversation. They had no idea that death was already watching them from the woods. Hermione's gaze flicked back to Dumbledore, and what she saw there made her stomach lurch with revulsion. The headmaster was watching the Potter family's final meal with the detached interest of a scholar observing an academic experiment. There was no grief in his expression, no horror at what was about to unfold, no desperate desire to intervene and save 3 innocent lives. Just calm, analytical attention, as if he were taking mental notes on the proceedings for some future report. This was what evil looked like, she realized with crystal clarity. Not the theatrical malevolence of Voldemort with his red eyes and serpentine features, but this, a kindly grandfather figure in half-moon spectacles, standing in peaceful silence while he allowed good people to die for purposes they would never understand. The pocket watch emerged again, checked with the same casual efficiency as before. Dumbledore's lips moved slightly. Not words, but the silent counting of someone monitoring a countdown. Whatever schedule he was following, whatever timeline governed this evening's events, it was approaching its crucial moment. Hermione wanted to scream. She wanted to burst from concealment and demand explanations, wanted to force Dumbledore to acknowledge what he was doing and why. She wanted to run to the Potter house and pound on their door, wanted to break the timeline and save them regardless of the consequences. She wanted to hex the headmaster where he stood. I wanted to make him pay for his monstrous passivity in the face of approaching tragedy. Instead, she remained frozen behind her concealment spells, trapped by the same temporal mechanics that had brought her here in the first place. She could not change what she knew had already happened. She could only watch and remember and carry the weight of this knowledge back to a future where Harry Potter still believed that Albus Dumbledore was the greatest wizard who had ever lived. In the distance, beyond the borders of Godric's Hollow, something dark was moving through the night. Something that had been summoned by betrayal and guided by information that should have been impossible to obtain. Something that would arrive in exactly. Dumbledore checked his watch again. 12 minutes and 37 seconds. The headmaster settled more comfortably into his position, prepared to witness the culmination of whatever plan he had set in motion. And in the house below, the Potter family continued their quiet evening, treasuring their last moments together, without realizing that those moments had been numbered from the very beginning. Hermione pressed her face against the oak tree's bark and wept silent tears for the death of heroes and the birth of terrible understanding. The night was far from over, but already it had cost her more than she had ever imagined possible, and the worst was yet to come. Chapter 5. The Dark Lord's Arrival. The silence that preceded evil was different from ordinary quiet, Hermione realized with crystalline clarity as the clock in Godric's Hollow church tower began to chime 8 o'clock. It was the kind of silence that fell over a forest when predators moved through the underbrush, a hush so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. Even the autumn wind had stilled, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. The 8th chime faded into nothingness, and with it died the last moments of the world as it had been. He appeared between one heartbeat and the next, materializing from shadow and malice at the edge of the Potter family's garden like a nightmare given form. Hermione had seen him before, through Harry's memories in the Pensive, in the graveyard where he had returned to corporeal form. But witnessing Lord Voldemort in the flesh of his original body was an experience that her mind struggled to process. He moved with fluid grace despite his unnatural height, dark robes flowing around him like liquid midnight. The pale skin of his face caught what little moonlight penetrated the cloud cover, and even from her position, 30 yards away, She could see the red gleam of eyes that held no trace of human warmth. But it was the certainty in his movements that truly terrified her. This wasn't the desperate hunt of a predator following uncertain trails. This was the confident approach of someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he would find when he arrived. Peter Pettigrew had done his work well, delivering not just the Potter's location, but clearly their exact schedule, their routines, their moments of greatest vulnerability. Voldemort paused at the garden gate, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. His lipless mouth curved in what might have been a smile, and when he moved again, it was with the patient deliberation of someone who had all the time in the world to savor what came next. He was in no hurry. Why should he be? There was nowhere for his victims to run, no escape from a trap that had been so perfectly laid. Through her concealment spells, Hermione felt the Dark Lord's magical presence wash over the area like a tide of ice water. The very air seemed to recoil from him, and she watched in horror as the grass beneath his feet withered and blackened with each step. This was what absolute evil felt like when it moved through the world. Not the theatrical malevolence of children's stories, but something far more fundamental. A corruption of the natural order so complete that it poisoned everything it touched. In her peripheral vision, she could see Dumbledore still maintaining his vigil behind the birch trees. The headmaster's posture hadn't changed by so much as an inch since Voldemort's arrival. He remained perfectly still, perfectly silent, making no move to intervene, despite possessing the power to end this before it began. His hands hung loose at his sides, his wand remaining sheathed within his robes, even as the most dangerous wizard in a century approached the home of a family he claimed to protect. The betrayal was so absolute, so monstrous, that Hermione felt something break inside her chest. Not just disappointment or disillusionment, but the actual death of something that could never be restored. The part of her that had believed in heroes, that had trusted in the fundamental goodness of those who claimed to fight for the light. Dumbledore's inaction wasn't the paralysis of fear or uncertainty. It was the calculated patience of someone watching his plans unfold exactly as intended. Voldemort reached the front door of the Potter home and paused again, this time raising one pale hand to trace sigils in the air. Even at this distance, Hermione could feel the malevolent power radiating from whatever spell he was weaving, something dark and complex that made her skin crawl and her magical senses recoil in instinctive revulsion. Ward-breaking magic, she realized with sick certainty. He was methodically dismantling every protection the Potters had woven around their home, unpicking their defenses with the casual expertise of someone who had done this many times before. The magical protections fell one by one, each collapse marked by a flash of sickly green light that made the shadows dance like living things. The Potters had been thorough in their preparations. Detection charms, barrier spells, emergency portkeys that should have activated the moment Voldemort's presence was detected. But Peter Pettigrew had known about all of them, had provided his new master with the exact information needed to counter every safeguard. The last ward fell with a sound like breaking glass, audible even from Hermione's position in the woods. Through the kitchen window she could see movement inside the house, James Potter dropping his evening tea and reaching for his wand with the reflexes of someone who had survived 3 years of open warfare. But it was too late. Far too late. Voldemort was already pushing open the front door, his pale face twisted with anticipation as he stepped across the threshold. "Lily, take Harry and go! It's him! Go! Run! I'll hold him off!" James Potter's voice carried clearly in the still air, raw with desperate love and absolutely certain courage. Hermione watched through the living room window as he positioned himself between the stairs and the advancing Dark Lord, his wand steady despite the impossible odds he faced. There was no hesitation in his stance, no moment of doubt or self-preservation. He knew he was about to die, and his only concern was buying his wife and son enough time to escape. Voldemort's response was wordless, a casual flick of his wand that sent a cutting curse slicing through the air with surgical precision. James tried to shield, tried to dodge, but he was fighting the most powerful dark wizard in centuries, with nothing but desperate love as armor. The curse took him in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall beside the fireplace, where he had been reading to his son just minutes before. The sound James Potter made as he died was not a scream. It was something far worse, a gasping cry of anguish for the family he was leaving behind. His body hit the floor with terrible finality, and the light in the living room window seemed to dim, as if the world itself was acknowledging the passing of a good man. Hermione bit down on her hand to keep from crying out, tasting blood as her teeth broke the skin. The rational part of her mind noted with detached precision that she was experiencing severe psychological trauma, or that witnessing this atrocity would leave scars on her psyche that would never fully heal. But the emotional part of her, the part that still remembered being 11 years old and falling in love with stories of heroism and sacrifice, was simply screaming, an endless internal wail of grief and rage and helpless horror. Dumbledore still had not moved. Voldemort stepped over James Potter's body without so much as glancing down, his attention already focused on the stairs that led to the upper floors where Lily Potter was running with her baby son clutched against her chest. His movements were unhurried, almost leisurely, the confidence of a predator who knew his prey was trapped. "Not Harry! Not Harry! Please not Harry!" Lily's voice echoed from the upper floor, high and desperate with maternal terror. She had barricaded herself in Harry's nursery, buying herself perhaps 30 seconds before Voldemort reached them. 30 seconds to say goodbye to her son, to hold him one last time, to prepare for a death she faced not out of duty or ideology, but out of pure, primal love for her child. "Stand aside, you silly girl. Stand aside now." Voldemort's voice was soft, almost conversational, carrying the particular cruelty of someone offering false mercy. He could have simply killed Lily Potter where she stood. Nothing she possessed could threaten him. No power she wielded could match his own. But he was savoring this, drawing out the moment before he murdered a helpless infant, taking pleasure in the mother's anguish. "Not Harry. Please no, take me. Kill me instead. This is my last warning. Not Harry. Or please, have mercy. Have mercy!" The exchange burned itself into Hermione's memory with perfect clarity, every word etched in acid across her consciousness. This was what love looked like in its purest form, not the romantic idealization of poets and storytellers, but the raw animal desperation of a mother willing to die for her child. Lily Potter wasn't a warrior or a hero or a symbol. She was simply a woman who loved her baby more than her own life, and that love was about to change the course of wizarding history. Avada Kedavra. The green light that erupted from the nursery window was visible even through the house's walls, a sickly emerald glow that painted the entire garden in shades of death. Hermione felt the killing curse's passage like a physical blow, the dark magic washing over her concealment spells and leaving her nauseated with its wrongness. Somewhere in that upstairs room, Lily Potter had just died protecting her son, and the world would never be quite the same. But something was wrong. The light from the nursery window was growing brighter, rather than fading, shifting from the green of the killing curse to something else, something golden and warm that seemed to push back against the darkness that had infected Godric's Hollow. Magic was building in that small room, ancient power responding to sacrifice and love in ways that even Voldemort couldn't predict or control. The explosion, when it came, was not the violent destruction of a building, but something far more fundamental. Reality itself rejecting the presence of absolute evil. The house shuddered, not with structural damage, but with the metaphysical shock of a force older than wizardry reasserting itself against corruption. The golden light blazed like a second sun, and Hermione watched in amazement as it began to consume the sickly green glow of dark magic. From somewhere in that blazing radiance came a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. not a scream of pain, but a wail of absolute shock and disbelief from a being who had forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable. Lord Voldemort, the most feared wizard in centuries, was experiencing something he had thought impossible. He was being destroyed. When the light finally faded, the silence that followed was different from what had come before. This wasn't the expectant hush that preceded violence, but the stunned quiet that followed revelation. But the air itself felt cleaner, as if something poisonous had been burned away, leaving behind the possibility of hope in a world that had nearly forgotten what hope felt like. From the ruined nursery came a new sound, thin, reedy, but unmistakably alive. Baby Harry Potter was crying, his infant voice carrying in the still air with the particular force of someone who had just experienced something that would mark him for the rest of his life. The boy who lived, crying alone in the wreckage of everything he had ever known, surrounded by the bodies of parents who had died to save him. And still, Albus Dumbledore did not move from his position among the birch trees. Hermione watched in stunned horror as the headmaster remained perfectly motionless, making no effort to rush to the aid of the crying infant, no attempt to secure the scene or tend to the wounded or do any of the things that a decent human being would do when confronted with such carnage. He simply waited, patient as stone, as if the death of two good people and the traumatization of an innocent child were nothing more than necessary steps in some larger calculation. The crying continued, growing weaker as shock and exhaustion took their toll on Harry's infant system. Soon, Hermione knew, Hagrid would arrive on Dumbledore's orders to collect the boy and take him to Privet Drive. But not yet. First, the headmaster would wait to ensure that Voldemort was truly gone, that his carefully orchestrated tragedy had achieved its intended purpose. The greatest good, she thought with bitter clarity. And this was what the greater good looked like when stripped of pretty rhetoric and noble intentions. Dead parents, a traumatized infant, and an old man who counted the cost in other people's blood while keeping his own hands clean. Hermione pressed her face against the oak tree's bark and wept for the death of innocence, not just the Potters but her own. She had come here seeking truth, and she had found it. But some truths were too terrible to bear, too monstrous to accept, too damaging to survive intact. The boy who lived cried alone in the darkness, and the man who had let his parents die waited patiently for the next phase of his plan to begin. And in the woods between them, a 17-year-old girl learned what it meant to witness the birth of legends built on foundations of calculated betrayal. Chapter 6. After the storm. For 5 full minutes after the magical explosion that had destroyed Voldemort, Dumbledore remained motionless among the birch trees. He stood with the patience of someone who understood that magical catastrophes required time to settle, that the ancient forces unleashed by Lily Potter's sacrifice needed space to stabilize before it was safe to approach. But his stillness wasn't the frozen shock of someone witnessing the unexpected. It was the calculated patience of someone waiting for a precisely timed event to reach its conclusion. When he finally moved, it was with the measured steps of a man following a script he had written himself. Hermione watched in fascinated horror as the headmaster emerged from concealment, no longer bothering to hide his presence now that the primary actors in tonight's drama had finished their roles. He approached the Potter home with the kind of purposeful efficiency that spoke of careful planning, his long robes billowing behind him as he crossed the garden where Voldemort had materialized less than half an hour earlier. But he didn't rush toward the house with the urgency of someone desperate to help survivors or tend to the wounded. Instead, he paused at the garden gate and withdrew his wand with deliberate precision, beginning to weave spells that made the air itself shimmer with complex magical patterns. The first series of charms were ones Hermione recognized from her extensive research into investigative magic, preservation spells designed to maintain the integrity of a crime scene, temporal locks that would prevent magical signatures from degrading over time, evidence-gathering enchantments that would catalogue every spell cast in the area. Standard aura procedure for any magical incident requiring investigation. But the second series of spells was something else entirely. Hermione's blood ran cold as she watched Dumbledore systematically modify the magical traces left by the evening's events. He wasn't preserving evidence. He was editing it, carefully adjusting the residual magic to support whatever narrative he intended others to discover. Temporal signatures were subtly shifted, magical resonances were enhanced or diminished, and the entire scene was being staged as methodically as any theatrical production. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had arrived to investigate a tragedy. This was the behavior of someone ensuring that when others came to investigate, they would find exactly what he wanted them to find. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Everything, the timeline, the evidence, the very magical signatures that would be used to reconstruct this night's events, was being manipulated by the one person everyone would trust to tell the truth about what had happened. When Aurors arrived to investigate, when the Ministry compiled its official report, when historians tried to understand how Harry Potter had survived the killing curse, they would be working with information that Dumbledore had carefully curated to support his version of events. How long had he been planning this? The question burned in her mind as she watched the headmaster work with the kind of practiced efficiency that could only come from extensive preparation. This wasn't improvisation. This was the execution of a plan so detailed, so thoroughly considered, that even the magical investigation of the crime scene had been accounted for and controlled. Dumbledore moved closer to the house, and Hermione could see his face clearly in the light spilling from the damaged windows. She had expected to see grief there, or guilt, or at least some acknowledgement of the human cost of whatever he had orchestrated. Instead, she saw only calm satisfaction, the expression of someone whose careful calculations had produced exactly the results he had intended. He stepped through the front door and disappeared from view, but she could track his progress through the house by the way the magical atmosphere continued to shift and change. More spells were being woven, more evidence was being arranged, and she realized with sick certainty that when he emerged, the official story of this night would be locked in place forever. The wait was agonizing. Baby Harry's cries had finally faded to exhausted whimpers, and the silence that followed was filled with the kind of magical tension that preceded either great healing or great harm. Hermione found herself holding her breath, straining to catch any sound that might hint at what Dumbledore was doing in the ruins of the Potter family's life. When he finally reappeared, it was through the front door, moving with the same unhurried confidence he had shown throughout the evening. But something had changed. There was a subtle difference in his posture, a new weight to his movements that suggested he was carrying something of significance. His right hand was closed around an object she couldn't see, something small enough to be concealed within his palm, but important enough to warrant the kind of careful attention usually reserved for the most dangerous of magical artifacts. Dumbledore paused in the garden and opened his hand, studying whatever he had retrieved from the ruined house. Even at a distance, Hermione could see the way the object seemed to drink in the moonlight, creating a small pool of darkness in his palm that made her eyes water to look at directly. The magical resonance coming from the thing was wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Not evil exactly, but twisted, incomplete, like a piece of a larger whole that had been violently separated from its source. A soul fragment. The realization hit her with the force of absolute certainty. Dumbledore had retrieved a piece of Voldemort's soul from the wreckage of the Potter home, a fragment that had been torn loose during the Dark Lord's destruction. But instead of destroying it, instead of ensuring that this piece of concentrated evil could never cause harm again, he was preserving it. Why? What possible use could such an abomination have in the hands of someone who claimed to fight for the light? Dumbledore closed his hand around the soul fragment and turned his attention back to the house. His wand moved in complex patterns, weaving spells that settled over the building like an invisible web. Ward magic, as she realized, protection spells that would shield whatever was inside from external threats. But as she watched, she began to understand that these wards weren't quite what they appeared to be. The defensive magic was real enough, powerful barriers that would repel most forms of magical attack. But woven through the protective spells were more subtle enchantments, monitoring charms that would track everyone who approached, observation magic that would record every conversation that took place within the house's walls, and beneath it all, a network of control spells so delicate she almost missed them entirely. Hermione's breath caught as the true purpose of the wards became clear. They weren't just protecting baby Harry from external threats. They were ensuring that when Hagrid arrived to collect him, when he was taken to Privet Drive, when he was placed with the Dursleys, every aspect of his life would be under Dumbledore's observation and influence. The headmaster was weaving a net of magical surveillance that would follow Harry Potter for years to come, ensuring that his development proceeded exactly according to whatever plan had been set in motion tonight. The boy who lived would never truly be free. From this moment forward, he would be watched, monitored, guided, and manipulated by the very man who had allowed his parents to die. Every choice Harry made, every relationship he formed, every moment of happiness or suffering he experienced would be data in some vast calculation that only Dumbledore understood. The headmaster stepped back from his work, surveying the scene with the critical eye of an artist evaluating a completed masterpiece. Or the magical atmosphere around the Potter home had been completely transformed. What had been chaotic destruction was now carefully organized tragedy. What had been random violence was now purposeful sacrifice. What had been the scene of a crime was now the birthplace of a legend. But Dumbledore wasn't finished. He withdrew the soul fragment once more, studying it in the moonlight with an expression that mixed scientific curiosity with something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. Then, with movements so quick and subtle that Hermione almost missed them, he approached the house again and placed the twisted piece of Voldemort's soul somewhere within the magical web he had woven around the building. The implications were staggering. He wasn't just monitoring Harry Potter's development, he was ensuring that the boy would carry a piece of the Dark Lord with him wherever he went. Whatever twisted purpose that soul fragment was meant to serve, it was now positioned to influence Harry's life in ways that no one else would ever suspect. Hermione felt nauseous with the scope of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just allowing tragedy to unfold for some greater good. This was actively corrupting a child's very soul in service of an agenda that only Dumbledore understood. Harry Potter wasn't just an orphan being placed with reluctant relatives. He was an experimental subject being prepared for a lifetime of manipulation and suffering, all under the guise of protection and care. The headmaster stepped back one final time, raising his wand to cast a spell that made the air around him shimmer and bend. Disapparition magic, Hermione realized. He was preparing to leave the scene, but not to safety or comfort or rest. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the careful consideration of timing that suggested his work was far from over. Within minutes, Hagrid would arrive on his flying motorcycle, devastated by the loss of his friends and desperate to help their orphaned son. He would find the scene exactly as Dumbledore had arranged it, would collect baby Harry exactly as he had been instructed, would deliver him to Privet Drive without ever suspecting that every aspect of the night's events had been choreographed by the man he trusted most in the world. The web of deception was perfect in its completeness. Everyone who investigated this night, Aurors, ministry officials, historians, even Harry himself when he was old enough to ask questions, would find evidence that supported the official story. The tragic deaths of James and Lily Potter, the miraculous survival of their son, the mysterious destruction of the Dark Lord, all of it would appear to be the result of chance and fate and love's protection. But Hermione had seen the truth. She had witnessed the careful orchestration, the deliberate manipulation, the calculated placement of monitoring magic and corrupted soul fragments. She had watched Albus Dumbledore weave a lie so perfect that even its victims would believe it, so complete that it would shape the wizarding world's understanding of heroism and sacrifice for decades to come. Dumbledore completed his disapparition spell and vanished from the garden, leaving behind only the faint scent of lemon drops and the terrible certainty that everything Hermione thought she knew about the war against darkness had been built on foundations of carefully managed betrayal. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of Hagrid's motorcycle approaching through the night sky. The gentle half-giant was coming to collect the boy who lived, completely unaware that he was participating in a deception that would define the rest of Harry Potter's life. Hermione remained hidden behind her concealment spells, watching as the next phase of Dumbledore's plan began to unfold. She had come here seeking answers about one night of tragedy. What she had found was evidence of a conspiracy so vast, so intricate, that it called into question everything she had ever believed about the nature of good and evil. Of the boy who lived, cried alone in the wreckage of his family's home, surrounded by magic that would shape his destiny in ways he would never understand. And somewhere in the darkness, the architect of that destiny was already moving to the next phase of a plan that had been years in the making. The night was far from over, but for Hermione Granger, the world had already ended. What remained was only the terrible task of deciding what to do with the truth she had discovered in the ashes of everything she had once believed. Chapter 7. The Giant's Arrival. The rumble of Hagrid's flying motorcycle grew steadily louder as it approached through the night sky, its magical engine coughing and sputtering in the way that spoke of age and careful maintenance rather than elegant engineering. Hermione could see the headlight cutting through the darkness long before the massive silhouette of Rubeus Hagrid became visible, hunched over the handlebars with his wild hair and beard streaming behind him in the wind. When he landed in the Potter family's garden, the impact sent tremors through the ground that Hermione could feel even from her position in the woods. But it wasn't the physical force of the landing that struck her most powerfully. It was the sound that Hagrid made as he took in the scene before him, a low moan of grief so raw and genuine that it cut through the night like a blade. This was what authentic emotion looked like in the face of tragedy. Not Dumbledore's calculating patience or clinical manipulation, but the unguarded anguish of someone who had just lost people he loved. So Hagrid stood beside his motorcycle for a long moment, his massive frame shaking with the force of barely contained sobs, and Hermione felt her heart break all over again for the contrast between his innocent pain and the orchestrated horror she had witnessed earlier. James. Lily. Hagrid's voice carried clearly in the still air, thick with tears and disbelief. He approached the damaged house with the hesitant steps of someone who feared what he might find inside, his gamekeeper's lantern casting wild shadows across the garden. Oh no, 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 no. The giant's grief was so palpable, so utterly without artifice, that Hermione had to bite down hard on her lower lip to keep from making a sound. Here was someone who had known James and Lily Potter as people rather than symbols, who had watched Harry grow from a newborn into a toddling infant, who was experiencing their loss as the death of friends rather than the successful completion of a strategic objective. Hagrid disappeared into the house, and Hermione could track his progress by the sounds that drifted through the damaged walls, furniture being moved aside, debris being cleared, and through it all the steady murmur of the half-giant's voice as he spoke to baby Harry with infinite gentleness. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, the careful, soothing cadence that adults used with frightened children, full of promise and protection and unconditional love. When Hagrid emerged from the house, he was carrying Harry with the kind of reverent care usually reserved for the most precious of treasures. The baby was wrapped in a blanket that looked like it had been pulled from the wreckage of his nursery, and Hermione could see that he was awake now, his impossibly green eyes fixed on Hagrid's tear-streaked face with the trusting attention that infants gave to anyone who held them with kindness. "It's all right, Harry," Hagrid murmured, his voice breaking on the words. "Old Hagrid's got you now. Everything's going to be all right, little man. I promise." The promise was heartfelt, absolutely sincere, and completely hollow, because Hagrid couldn't know what Dumbledore had really planned for baby Harry Potter. He thought he was rescuing an orphaned child, providing comfort and safety in the wake of unspeakable tragedy. He had no idea that he was actually delivering Harry into a carefully orchestrated nightmare that would define the rest of his childhood. Hermione watched the gentle giant settle Harry more securely in his massive arms, and the contrast with what she had witnessed earlier made her feel physically ill. Hagrid's love for this baby was obvious in every line of his body, every careful adjustment of his grip, every soft word he whispered into the night. He would die before he allowed harm to come to James and Lily's son, and he was about to hand him over to people who would spend the next 11 years making Harry's life a calculated misery, all because he trusted Albus Dumbledore without question. The sound of approaching footsteps made Hagrid's head snap up, his free hand moving instinctively toward the pink umbrella that concealed his broken wand. But when the figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the garden, his expression shifted from wariness to shocked recognition. Sirius? Sirius Black looked like he had aged 10 years in the space of a few hours. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his dark hair hanging in tangled locks around a face that was grey with shock and exhaustion. But it was his eyes that truly revealed the depth of his anguish, wild and desperate, filled with a grief so profound it seemed to have burned away everything else he might once have been. "Hagrid!" Sirius's voice was hoarse, as if he had been screaming. "Oh God, Hagrid, tell me it's not true. Tell me they're not really. I'm sorry, Sirius." Hagrid's words were gentle, but final. "They're gone, both of them. Died protecting little Harry here." Sirius's knees buckled, and for a moment Hermione thought he might collapse entirely. But then his gaze fell on the baby in Hagrid's arms, and something shifted in his expression, raw pain transmuting into fierce determination. "Give him to me." The words came out sharp and urgent, cutting through the night air like a command. "Give me Harry, Hagrid. I'm his godfather. I have the right—" "I can't do that, Sirius." Hagrid took a step back, his grip on Harry tightening protectively. "Got me orders from Dumbledore himself. Harry's to go to his aunt and uncle." "His aunt and uncle?" Sirius's voice cracked on the words. "Hagrid, you can't be serious. Lily hated her sister. She told me stories. The Dursleys are the worst sort of muggles. They're the kind who think magic is some kind of disease. They'll make his life hell." "That's not for us to decide," Hagrid said. But there was uncertainty in his voice now, a flicker of doubt that suggested Sirius's words were hitting their mark. "Dumbledore knows what's best. He always does." "Does he?" The question came out like a whip crack, and Hermione felt her breath catch at the raw suspicion in Sirius's voice. "Does he really, Hagrid? Because I can't help but wonder how Voldemort knew where to find them. We changed the secret keeper at the last minute, made Peter the one who knew their location. Only 3 people in the world should have been able to give away their hiding place." Sirius's words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither man wanted to voice directly. But Hermione could see the doubt growing in Hagrid's expression, the way his certainty was beginning to crack under the weight of questions he had never thought to ask. "Peter's dead," Hagrid said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Killed by you-know-who after he gave up the location. That's what happened, Sirius. That's what Dumbledore told me. Is Peter dead?" Sirius's laugh was bitter, edged with a kind of hysteria that spoke of a mind pushed beyond its breaking point. "Are you sure about that, Hagrid? Because I've been hunting him all night, and funny thing, I can't find a body. Can't find any trace of him at all, actually. Almost like he just vanished." The silence that followed was pregnant with terrible possibilities. Hermione watched Hagrid's face cycle through confusion, doubt, and finally a kind of desperate denial as the implications of Sirius's words began to sink in. "You're upset," Hagrid said finally, but his voice was shaking now. "Not thinking straight. Course Peter's dead. Course he is. Dumbledore wouldn't lie about something like that." "Wouldn't he?" Sirius took a step closer, his desperate eyes fixed on the baby in Hagrid's arms. Give me Harry, Hagrid. I can protect him. I can keep him safe, give him a life where he's loved and wanted. And I have me orders." Hagrid's voice was firmer now, but Hermione could see the pain in his expression as he spoke. "I'm sorry, Sirius, I really am. But Dumbledore was very clear. Harry goes to the Dursleys, and that's final. Then give me your bike." The request came out in a rush, desperate and pleading. "Let me take him there myself, at least. Let me see him safely delivered. Make sure they understand how precious he is." Hagrid hesitated, and for a moment Hermione thought he might agree. The request was reasonable, born of Godfather's love and genuine concern for Harry's welfare. What harm could there be in allowing Sirius to accompany them to Privet Drive? But then something shifted in Hagrid's expression, some memory of more specific instructions filtering through his grief-clouded mind. "Can't do it, Sirius. Dumbledore said I was to go alone, take the bike myself. Said it was important that nobody else be involved." Hagrid's voice was apologetic but immovable. "I'm sorry, but those were me orders." Sirius stared at him for a long moment, and Hermione could see the exact instant when the last of his hope died. The wild desperation in his eyes was replaced by something harder, colder, the look of a man who was beginning to understand that the world he had trusted was built on foundations of lies. "Of course they were," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Hermione's skin crawl. Of course Dumbledore wouldn't want witnesses, wouldn't want anyone else to see exactly where Harry Potter is being sent, or why. "Sirius, take the bike." Sirius's voice was flat now, emotionless, in a way that was somehow more disturbing than his earlier hysteria. "Take it and go. Deliver Harry to his loving family, just like the great Albus Dumbledore ordered. I'm sure they'll take wonderful care of him." The bitterness in those last words was so sharp it could have cut glass. Hagrid winced, as if he had been physically struck, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he moved toward the flying motorcycle with Harry still cradled carefully in his arms, his massive shoulders slumped with the weight of decisions he didn't understand but felt compelled to follow. "I'm sorry, Sirius," he said again, as he settled Harry into the sidecar that had been magically modified to keep an infant safe during flight. "I know this isn't what you wanted. But Dumbledore knows best," Sirius finished, and the word sounded like a curse on his lips. "Yes, Hagrid, I'm sure he does." The motorcycle's engine roared to life, drowning out any further conversation. Hagrid guided the machine into the air with the careful movements of someone carrying the most precious cargo in the world. And Hermione watched them disappear into the night sky, the gentle giant who thought he was protecting a child, and the baby who was being delivered into a life of deliberate suffering. Left alone in the ruined garden, Sirius Black stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring up at the empty sky with an expression that spoke of worlds ending and innocence dying. When he finally moved, it was with the sharp, decisive gestures of someone who had made a terrible decision. Hermione watched him transform into his animagus form, watched the great black dog that was his other self throw back its head and howl, a sound of such raw anguish that it seemed to speak for everyone who had been betrayed by the events of this night. Then he was gone, and racing into the darkness to hunt down the friend who had destroyed everything they had all believed in. The Potter home stood empty now, its windows dark and its rooms filled with nothing but shadows and the lingering traces of Dumbledore's manipulation. In a few hours, ministry officials would arrive to investigate the scene, and they would find exactly what the headmaster had arranged for them to find. The official story would be written, the legend of the boy who lived would begin, and Harry Potter would disappear into a childhood of calculated abuse disguised as protection, and everyone, Hagrid, the ministry officials, the entire wizarding world, would believe they were doing the right thing. Hermione remained hidden in the woods long after the last traces of magic had faded from the night air, her mind struggling to process the full scope of what she had witnessed. This wasn't just murder or manipulation. It was the orchestrated corruption of everyone who had tried to do good, the systematic perversion of love and loyalty into tools of oppression. Dumbledore hadn't just killed James and Lily Potter. He had weaponized the grief of everyone who loved them, had turned their friends into unwitting accomplices in a plan that would destroy the very child they were trying to protect. The greatest good, she thought with bitter clarity. This was what sacrifice for the greater good really looked like. Not noble death in battle, but the slow poisoning of everything decent and kind, until even love itself became a tool of manipulation. Somewhere in the night sky above England, Hagrid was flying toward Privet Drive with a baby who would spend the next 11 years learning that he was unwanted, unloved, and worthless. And somewhere in the shadows, Albus Dumbledore was already planning the next phase of whatever scheme had required such a monstrous foundation. The night was ending, but the nightmare was just beginning, and Hermione Granger was the only person in the world who knew the truth about how it had really started. Chapter 8. The McGonagall Deception. The flight to Little Whinging took longer than Hermione had expected, though she supposed time moved differently when you were tracking a flying motorcycle through the pre-dawn darkness while maintaining concealment spells that were already stretched thin from hours of continuous use. Her magic felt brittle and unstable after the temporal displacement, each casting requiring more effort than it should have, but she forced herself to maintain the invisibility and silencing charms that kept her hidden as she followed Hagrid's laborious progress across the English countryside. The damaged time-turner, now nothing more than twisted metal in her pocket, seemed to pulse with residual temporal energy every few minutes, sending waves of nausea through her system that made maintaining her flight path increasingly difficult. But she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close to understanding the full scope of what Dumbledore had orchestrated. Little Whinging materialized below them as a sprawling maze of identical suburban streets, each lined with houses that seemed to have been designed by committee to eliminate any trace of individuality or character. Even from the air, the place felt suffocating, a monument to mundane conformity where anything unusual would stand out like a beacon. The perfect place, Hermione realized with sick understanding, to hide a child whose very existence was magical. Hagrid's motorcycle began its descent toward Privet Drive, and Hermione followed at a safe distance, her enhanced vision allowing her to track his movements even as her own broom struggled to maintain altitude under the strain of prolonged magical concealment. The street they approached was a perfect example of suburban banality: neat lawns, identical driveways, and windows that reflected nothing but the darkness of early November morning. But there was something else waiting in the shadows of Privet Drive, something that made Hermione's already strained magical senses prickle with recognition. As Hagrid settled his motorcycle near number 4 with practiced care, a tabby cat emerged from beneath a parked car and began the fluid transformation that marked a master of transfiguration at work. Professor McGonagall stood in the dim light of the street lamps, her usually immaculate appearance slightly rumpled after what must have been hours of surveillance. Her stern face was creased with worry lines that seemed deeper than usual, and when she spoke to Hagrid, her voice carried a note of distress that Hermione had rarely heard from the deputy headmistress. "Hagrid," McGonagall said, her Scottish accent more pronounced than usual with stress and fatigue. "Finally, I've been waiting here all day, watching those people." "Professor McGonagall." Hagrid's greeting was subdued, as exhaustion evident in every line of his massive frame. "How are they? The Dursleys, I mean. Are they suitable?" The pause that followed was pregnant with terrible implications. McGonagall's expression cycled through several emotions: disgust, anger, and something that looked disturbingly like despair, before settling into the kind of carefully controlled neutrality that spoke of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Suitable?" McGonagall's voice was sharp with poorly suppressed outrage. "Hagrid, these are the worst sort of muggles imaginable. I've been watching them all day, watching the husband bellowing at his wife, watching the wife shriek at their infant son for crying, watching them treat their own child like an inconvenience to be endured rather than a blessing to be cherished. From her position, high above the street, Hermione felt ice water forming in her veins. This wasn't the report of someone who had found a loving family ready to care for an orphaned nephew. This was the testimony of someone who had witnessed exactly the kind of household that would turn Harry Potter's childhood into a systematic nightmare. "They're cruel, Hagrid." McGonagall's voice was growing more strained with each word. "Cruel in the petty, grinding way that destroys children's spirits piece by piece. The way Vernon Dursley speaks to his wife, the way Petunia Dursley handles their baby. There's no love in that house, no kindness, no warmth, only resentment and anger and the kind of small-minded hatred that feeds on anything different from itself." Hagrid's expression was growing more troubled with each detail, but he clutched baby Harry closer to his chest, as if physical protection could somehow shield the infant from the psychological damage that McGonagall was describing. "But they're family," he said, and the words sounded like someone trying to convince himself of something he desperately wanted to believe. "They're his only family, Professor. Surely that counts for something." "Family?" McGonagall's laugh was bitter, completely unlike the dry humour Hermione was used to hearing from the Transfiguration Professor. "Hagrid, I watched Petunia Dursley's face when she received the news about her sister's death. There was no grief there, no sorrow for a life cut short, only satisfaction. She was pleased, Hagrid, pleased that Lily was dead." The words hit Hermione like physical blows, as each revelation building a more complete picture of the horror that Harry was about to endure. This wasn't just placing an orphaned child with reluctant relatives. This was delivering him into the hands of people who would see his very existence as an insult to everything they believed in. "And you want to leave Harry with these people?" McGonagall continued, her voice rising with each word. "These people who will see his magic as a disease to be cured, his heritage as a shame to be hidden? Hagrid, they'll make his life a misery. They'll convince him that he's worthless, unwanted, a burden that they're grudgingly bearing out of duty rather than love." From somewhere behind them came the soft pop of apparition. And Hermione watched as Albus Dumbledore materialized on the pavement with the quiet confidence of someone arriving exactly when and where he had always intended to be. Even in the dim light of the street lamps, his presence seemed to fill the space around him, commanding attention through sheer force of accumulated authority and reputation. "Professor McGonagall," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying its usual notes of gentle warmth and unshakable certainty. "Hagrid, I trust the evening's work has proceeded according to plan." McGonagall turned toward him with an expression of desperate hope, as if his arrival might somehow solve the moral crisis that had been building in her mind throughout her day of observation. "Albus, we need to discuss this placement. I've been watching the Dursleys all day, and I must tell you, yes, I'm sure you have concerns," Dumbledore interrupted gently, but with the kind of finality that suggested the conversation was already concluded in his mind. "The Dursleys are not ideal guardians by any conventional measure, but conventional wisdom, I'm afraid, does not apply to Harry Potter's situation." "Not ideal?" McGonagall's voice cracked with disbelief. "Albus, they're monsters. Petty, small-minded monsters who will take out their hatred of magic on an innocent child. You can't seriously intend to—" "I intend to place Harry where he will be safest," Dumbledore said, and there was steel beneath the gentle tone now, the iron will that had guided his decisions through decades of impossible choices. "Not where he will be happiest, Minerva. Not where he will be most loved. Where he will be safest." "How is abuse safety?" McGonagall demanded, and Hermione could hear tears in her voice now, the sound of someone watching principles she had dedicated her life to defending being systematically demolished. "How is systematic cruelty protection?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying McGonagall's face with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was measuring her capacity to understand and accept what he was about to tell her. "Because, my dear Minerva," he said finally, "Harry Potter must grow up away from the magical world. He must learn humility, must understand struggle, must develop the strength that comes only from overcoming hardship. The Dursleys will ensure that he never becomes arrogant, never takes his abilities for granted, or never believes that he is entitled to special treatment simply because of who his parents were." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of understanding through Hermione's consciousness that made her feel physically sick. This wasn't just callous indifference to Harry's welfare. This was deliberate, calculated psychological conditioning designed to shape him into whatever tool Dumbledore needed him to become. "You're talking about deliberately traumatizing a child," McGonagall whispered, and the horror in her voice was absolute. "You're talking about using abuse as a form of character building. I'm talking about preparing him for a destiny that will require extraordinary sacrifice," Dumbledore replied, and his voice held no trace of doubt or regret. "Or Harry Potter will face challenges that would break most adults, Minerva. If he grows up believing that he is special, that he deserves love and protection and kindness, he will not have the strength to do what must be done." "What must be done?" McGonagall's question came out as barely more than a breath. Dumbledore's smile was gentle and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Save the world, of course. But salvation, I'm afraid, requires someone willing to be sacrificed, and willing sacrifice requires a very particular kind of preparation. Hermione pressed her hands to her mouth to keep from screaming, the full scope of Dumbledore's plan finally becoming clear. He wasn't just placing Harry with abusive relatives. He was systematically destroying the boy's self-worth, his understanding of love, his very sense of being worthy of life and happiness. Everything was designed to ensure that when the time came for Harry to die for the greater good, he would go willingly, believing that his death was a small price to pay for the safety of others. The Dursleys weren't guardians. They were psychological weapons, carefully selected for their capacity to inflict the precise kind of emotional damage that would make Harry expendable in his own mind. "Albus," McGonagall began, but her voice was shaking now, the words of protest dying on her lips as she began to understand the magnitude of what she was being asked to participate in. "The protection his mother's sacrifice provides will only work while he calls this place home," Dumbledore continued, as if her obvious distress was merely a minor inconvenience to be managed. "And it will only truly be home if he has nowhere else to go, no other place where he feels wanted or valued. The Dursleys will ensure that Privet Drive remains his only refuge, no matter how inadequate that refuge might be." With movements that spoke of long practice and careful planning, Dumbledore withdrew a letter from his robes and placed it carefully beside the infant car seat where Harry lay sleeping. The baby had remained unconscious throughout the entire discussion, exhausted by trauma and magical displacement, completely unaware that his fate was being decided by the very people who claimed to be protecting him. "The letter explains the situation to the Dursleys," Dumbledore said, his tone returning to its usual warmth as if they had just concluded a pleasant academic discussion rather than planned, systematic child abuse. "Oh, it emphasizes their duty, their obligation to take Harry in despite their reservations about his parentage." He paused, studying the sleeping infant with the kind of clinical attention that a researcher might give to a particularly interesting laboratory specimen. "It also makes clear that any failure to provide basic care, food, shelter, education, will result in consequences that they will find most unpleasant." "Basic care," McGonagall repeated, and the words came out flat and lifeless. "But not love, not kindness, not the things that children actually need to grow into healthy adults." "Harry Potter cannot be allowed to grow into a healthy adult in the conventional sense," Dumbledore replied with gentle finality. "He must grow into someone capable of extraordinary sacrifice. And that, I'm afraid, requires a very particular kind of childhood The three of them stood in silence for a moment, looking down at baby Harry as he slept peacefully in his car seat, completely unaware that his childhood had just been systematically destroyed before it could properly begin. In the distance, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale gold that seemed to mock the darkness of what they were contemplating. "Come," Dumbledore said finally, turning away from the sleeping infant, with the casual ease of someone who had just completed an unremarkable task. "Our work here is finished. Young Harry will be discovered by his relatives in due course, and his new life will begin exactly as it should." McGonagall followed him with the mechanical movements of someone whose world had just been fundamentally altered, her usual proud bearing replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear. Hagrid remained for a moment longer, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the baby he had loved and protected, knowing that he was abandoning Harry to years of deliberate suffering. "I'm sorry, little one," he whispered, the words so quiet that only Hermione's enhanced hearing allowed her to catch them. "I'm so sorry." Then he too was gone, climbing aboard his motorcycle and disappearing into the dawn sky, leaving Harry Potter alone on a doorstep in November cold, surrounded by nothing but a letter and the twisted love of relatives who would spend the next 11 years teaching him that he was worthless. From her position high above Privet Drive, Hermione watched the empty street and felt something fundamental break inside her chest. This wasn't just child abuse. It was the systematic engineering of a victim, the careful cultivation of someone whose self-worth had been so thoroughly destroyed that he would eventually choose death without hesitation. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, had just been sentenced to a childhood designed to teach him that his life had no value except as a tool to be used by others. And the man who had passed that sentence was already walking away into the dawn, his conscience apparently untroubled by what he had just orchestrated. The greater good, Hermione thought with bitter understanding. This was what the greater good looked like when stripped of all pretense and noble rhetoric. It looked like a baby sleeping alone on a doorstep, while the adults who claimed to love him walked away into the darkness. Chapter 9. The Return Journey. Dawn was breaking over Little Whinging when Hermione finally descended from her aerial vigil, her concealment spells flickering and failing as exhaustion and magical strain took their inevitable toll. She landed heavily in a small park several streets away from Privet Drive, her legs nearly buckling beneath her as the accumulated stress of the night's revelations crashed down upon her with physical force. The twisted remains of the Time Turner felt like a lead weight in her pocket, its once elegant mechanisms now fused into an unrecognizable mass of gold and temporal magic that pulsed with unstable energy. She withdrew it with trembling hands, studying the damage by the pale light of early morning. The crystal heart of the device was cracked in a dozen places, leaking wisps of silver light that dissipated immediately upon contact with the November air. The delicate chains that had once held the hourglass steady were snapped and melted, and the entire apparatus radiated the kind of dangerous magical instability that would have sent any sane witch running for cover. But Hermione was no longer entirely sane. The events of the past few hours had stripped away too many illusions, revealed too many horrible truths, left her standing in the ruins of everything she had once believed about heroism and sacrifice, and the fundamental goodness of those who claimed to fight for the light. The Time Turner was her only hope of returning to her own time, of carrying the knowledge she had gained back to a world where it might somehow make a difference, even if using it killed her. She settled cross-legged on the dew-damp grass, placing the ruined device carefully before her, and began to examine it with the methodical precision that had served her so well throughout her academic career. The damage was extensive, but not necessarily fatal. Temporal magic was among the most resilient forms of enchantment, designed to withstand forces that would shatter conventional spellwork. The question wasn't whether the Time Turner could still function, But whether it could function safely enough to carry her across 13 years of accumulated time without tearing her apart in the process. The mathematical calculations involved were staggering in their complexity. She needed to account not just for the temporal displacement itself, but for the accumulated magical instabilities the device had suffered, the way damaged components might interact with undamaged ones, the possibility that the broken crystal might create temporal echoes or paradoxes that could fracture causality itself. Each variable she identified spawned dozens more, until she was working with equations that existed at the very edge of theoretical possibility. But theoretical possibility was all she had. Taking a deep breath that tasted of morning frost and the lingering traces of dark magic, Hermione began to turn the ruined time-turner. The first rotation felt wrong immediately. Instead of the smooth, precise motion she was accustomed to, the mechanism lurched and ground against itself, metal shrieking in protest as damaged components tried to fulfill their intended function. Sparks of temporal energy danced across her fingers, each one carrying the sensation of past and future, colliding in ways that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. But she persevered, counting rotations with grim determination. 1 hour forward, 2, 10, 100. The broken time-turner grew hot in her hands, its damaged crystal pulsing with increasingly unstable light as she forced it to bend time in directions it was no longer designed to handle. At the 1000th rotation, reality exploded. The temporal shockwave hit her like a physical blow, sending her tumbling across the grass as the fabric of space and time convulsed around her. The park flickered and wavered, becoming simultaneously the empty field it had been in 1981, and the developed recreational area it would become in later years. She could see children playing on swings that existed in multiple decades at once, their laughter echoing across temporal boundaries as past and future bled into each other with nightmarish intensity. When the chaos finally settled, Hermione found herself lying on her back beneath a grey November sky, the taste of copper and ozone thick in her mouth. The time-turner had gone dark, its magical energy temporarily exhausted by the violent displacement. Around her, the world seemed stable again, but something was fundamentally wrong with the quality of the light, the way the shadows fell, the very texture of reality itself. She sat up slowly, wincing as her head spun with temporal displacement vertigo, and checked the newspaper that had been discarded on a nearby bench. November 15th, 1981. 2 weeks forward, instead of 13 years. The device had barely managed to move her a fortnight through time before suffering what appeared to be a complete magical breakdown. But as she studied the damaged time-turner more closely, she realized it wasn't entirely inert. Deep within the cracked crystal, silver light still pulsed with stubborn persistence, and she could feel the ancient magic stirring, gathering itself for another attempt. The device was hurt, possibly dying, but it wasn't dead yet. The second attempt came 3 days later, after she had found shelter in an abandoned building on the outskirts of Little Whinging, and spent precious time researching temporal repair techniques in what few magical texts she could access. She had managed to shore up some of the more obvious structural damage using emergency healing charms, but the fundamental instabilities remained, growing worse with each passing hour as damaged components continued to deteriorate. This time, she tried a different approach. Smaller jumps, more frequent stops, allowing the device time to stabilize between major displacements. The technique worked, after a fashion. She managed to advance herself nearly 6 months before the time-turner's protests became too violent to ignore, landing in a London that was slowly beginning to recover from the terror of Voldemort's first war. But the temporal echoes were getting worse. Every jump left traces of herself, scattered across the timeline, ghostly after-images that existed in the spaces between seconds. She could see them sometimes in her peripheral vision, dozens of Hermiones from different moments, all trying to return home, all trapped in the same impossible situation. The boundaries between past and present were growing thin, and she began to understand that she was fracturing more than just time. She was fracturing herself, spreading her existence across multiple temporal coordinates in ways that the human soul was never designed to endure. The third attempt nearly killed her. Emboldened by her partial success, she tried to make a larger jump, 5 years in a single displacement, hoping to reach the late 1980s before attempting the final push to 1994. The time turner responded with what could only be described as temporal rage, its damaged mechanism screaming in protest as forces beyond its capacity to contain tore through its crystal heart. Reality didn't just fracture this time, it shattered. Hermione found herself existing in multiple time streams simultaneously, experiencing every moment between 1986 and 1994 as a single, overwhelming instant of sensation. She was 11 years old, receiving her Hogwarts letter, 13 years old, facing the basilisk, 17 years old, watching Harry's parents die, all at the same time, all equally real, all competing for space in a mind that could only process linear experience. The temporal storm lasted for what felt like hours, but probably occupied no time at all, pulling her consciousness through decades of possibility before finally spitting her out onto the grass of a Hogwarts she didn't recognize, in a year she couldn't identify, with a time turner that was now more magical scar tissue than functional device. But she was closer. She could feel it in the quality of the magic around her, in the way the castle's ancient stones hummed with accumulated history. This was 1992, maybe 1993, close enough to her own time that she could sense the familiar temporal currents of her home era pulling at her damaged soul. The final attempt would have to be powered by more than just the time turner's failing magic. She could feel the device reaching the absolute limit of its endurance, its crystal heart barely holding together through sheer stubborn will and the last traces of ancient enchantment. If she was going to make the final jump home, she would need to supplement its power with her own life force, would need to pour her magic and her will, and perhaps her very soul into the broken mechanism until it had enough strength for one last, desperate leap through time. The calculations were beyond complex now. They were approaching the realm of pure magical intuition, the kind of instinctive understanding that came only to those who had pushed themselves far beyond the boundaries of safe magical practice. But Hermione had always been good at pushing boundaries, had always been willing to sacrifice safety for knowledge, comfort for truth. She held the dying time turner against her chest and began to pour everything she had into its fractured heart. Her magic, her memories, her desperate love for the friends she was trying to return to. All of it flowed into the device until she could no longer tell where she ended, and it began. The crystal blazed with silver fire that had nothing to do with temporal mechanics and everything to do with the raw force of human will refusing to accept defeat. The final jump was not a journey but a catastrophe. Time itself seemed to reject what she was attempting, reality convulsing around her, as past and future collided with forces that should have rendered her down to component atoms. She was falling through decades again, but this time she was falling upward, not climbing through years and wars and the accumulated weight of history toward a future that existed only because she chose to believe it was possible. Somewhere in the chaos, the time turner finally died. She felt it go, felt the ancient magic that had sustained it for centuries finally give way under the impossible strain she had subjected it to. But by then she was beyond its help, carried forward by nothing but her own determination and the terrible knowledge that she could not, would not, allow what she had witnessed to remain buried in the past. The landing was gentler than she had expected, a soft settling back into the familiar rhythms of her own time rather than the violent displacement she had experienced in her previous attempts. She opened eyes she didn't remember closing and found herself lying on the floor of the same abandoned classroom where her journey had begun, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on a Hogwarts that existed in the proper year, with the proper seasons, with the proper weight of accumulated history. June 1994. She was home. The time turner was completely dead now, nothing but twisted metal and glass in her hands. But she was alive, and more importantly, she knew. She carried within her memory the complete truth about October 31st, 1981. The deliberate orchestration, the calculated betrayals, the systematic engineering of a child's suffering for purposes that only Albus Dumbledore understood. The knowledge felt like poison in her veins, toxic and corrosive and absolutely necessary. Someone had to know. Someone had to remember. Or someone had to ensure that Harry Potter eventually learned the truth about why his parents had really died, and who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. She had returned from her journey through time, changed in fundamental ways, scarred by revelations that would never fully heal. But she had returned with something more valuable than innocence or peace of mind. She had returned with the truth, and truth, however terrible, was the only weapon that could eventually set Harry Potter free from the web of manipulation that had been woven around his life from the moment of his birth. The hardest part of her journey was over, but in many ways, the most dangerous part was just beginning. Chapter 10. Changed by Truth. The first thing Hermione noticed upon returning to the familiar confines of Hogwarts was how wrong everything felt. The castle's ancient stones hummed with the same magical resonance they always had. The portraits gossiped in their frames with unchanged enthusiasm, and the very air still carried the comforting sense of parchment and candle wax that had defined her school years. But beneath all that familiar comfort lay something new and terrible, the weight of knowledge that no 17-year-old should have to carry, memories that would color every interaction with shadows of betrayal and manipulation. The second thing she noticed was that the world had moved on without her, according to the temporal displacement that had scattered her across multiple failed jumps. 3 days had passed since her disappearance from the dormitory, 3 days during which Harry and Ron had apparently torn the castle apart looking for her, during which McGonagall had organized search parties, during which even Dumbledore himself had made inquiries about her whereabouts with that particular combination of concern and calculation that she now recognized as his signature approach to managing crisis situations. She found Harry and Ron in the common room, looking haggard and sleep-deprived in the way that spoke of genuine worry rather than academic stress. Ron was slumped over a half-finished charms essay, his quill hanging limp in his fingers, while Harry stared blankly at the fire with the kind of unfocused attention that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely. Or neither of them noticed her entrance until she spoke, and when they did look up, the relief in their expressions was so immediate and overwhelming that it made her chest tight with guilt. "Hermione!" Harry's voice cracked on her name as he launched himself from his chair, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick strides before pulling her into a hug that spoke of desperation, barely held in check. "Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere. McGonagall organized patrols. Hagrid checked the Forbidden Forest. We even asked the house elves if they'd seen you. What happened? Are you hurt?" The questions came in a rush, underlaid with the kind of raw fear that she had heard in his voice only a few times before, when facing basilisks and dementors and the various horrors that seemed to stalk his existence with inexorable persistence. But this fear was different, more personal somehow. This was the fear of losing someone he loved to forces beyond his understanding or control. Ron's arms wrapped around both of them from behind, completing a group embrace that should have felt comforting, but instead made Hermione acutely aware of the vast gulf that now existed between what she knew and what they believed. She was no longer the same person who had left this common room 3 nights ago. The girl who had returned carried secrets that would destroy everything these boys thought they understood about their world, about the people they trusted, or about the very nature of the conflict that had shaped all their lives. "I'm fine," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'm sorry I worried you. I was researching something in the library. Lost track of time. It was a pathetic excuse, transparent in its inadequacy, but Harry and Ron seized on it with the desperate relief of people who needed to believe that their friend was safe more than they needed the explanation to make perfect sense. They pulled back to study her face, their expressions cycling through relief, residual worry, and the beginning stirrings of curiosity about what could have kept her away for 3 full days. "Researching what?" Ron asked, his voice still shaky with the aftershocks of fear. "Hermione, you missed meals, you missed classes, you never came back to the dormitory. Parvati and Lavender were convinced something terrible had happened to you." She could see them both cataloguing the changes in her appearance, the exhaustion that had settled into her bones, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought they weren't looking, the particular quality of weariness that came from witnessing things that could never be unseen. But they were interpreting those signs through the lens of academic obsession rather than temporal trauma, assuming that whatever had consumed her attention for the past 3 days was simply another example of her legendary dedication to research rather than evidence of a journey that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her existence. "Time travel theory," she said, which was technically true if woefully incomplete. "I found some inconsistencies in the historical record about you-know-who's first war, and I wanted to understand how certain events could have unfolded the way they did." Harry's expression grew more alert at the mention of Voldemort's previous activities, his natural curiosity about anything related to his parents' deaths warring with concern for her obvious exhaustion. What kind of inconsistencies? The question hung between them like a landmine, innocent in its phrasing, but devastating in its implications. How could she possibly explain that she had discovered that everything he believed about his parents' deaths was a carefully constructed lie? How could she tell him that the man he trusted most in the world had orchestrated the very tragedy that defined his existence? How could she reveal that his entire childhood had been deliberately engineered to break his spirit, to prepare him for a destiny that required him to die willingly for the greater good? "Timeline issues," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral, despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Gaps in the sequence of events, witness statements that don't quite align with the physical evidence. Nothing that changes the basic facts, just details that don't quite add up." It was a masterpiece of misdirection, containing enough truth to satisfy their immediate curiosity while concealing the earth-shattering reality of what she had actually discovered. But even as the words left her mouth, she felt something precious and irreplaceable crack inside her chest. This was what betrayal felt like when you were the one doing the betraying, not the sharp pain of sudden injury, but the slow, grinding ache of watching people you love continue to trust you while you systematically concealed truths that could set them free. Ron seemed satisfied with her explanation, his natural inclination to avoid complex magical theory, making him willing to accept that she had gotten lost in research that was too advanced for him to understand. But Harry's expression remained troubled, his eyes searching her face with the kind of attention that came from too many years of people lying to him about things that mattered. "Hermione," he said quietly, his voice carrying the particular weight that meant he was about to ask a question she didn't want to answer. "Are you sure you're all right? You look different, like something happened to you." The observation was so accurate, so precisely targeted at her greatest vulnerability, that for a moment she felt the careful walls she was building around her secret begin to crumble. Harry had always been perceptive about the people he cared about, gifted with the kind of emotional intuition that allowed him to see past surface explanations to the deeper truths beneath. If anyone was going to see through her carefully constructed lies, it would be him. "I'm just tired," she managed, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass against her lips. "You know how I get when I'm researching something interesting. I tend to forget about little things like food and sleep." The explanation seemed to satisfy him, at least on a surface level. But she could see that he was filing away his concerns for later examination. Harry Potter had learned early in life that the adults around him were often less than truthful about things that mattered, and that combination of natural suspicion and hard-earned wisdom would make him a dangerous audience for her deceptions. The next few days passed in a haze of carefully maintained normalcy that felt like an elaborate performance. She attended classes, completed assignments, participated in conversations about end-of-term examinations and summer holiday plans. But underneath the familiar rhythms of school life, she found herself studying everything and everyone with new eyes, seeing patterns of manipulation and control that had been invisible to her before her journey into the past. Watching Dumbledore during meals became an exercise in controlled horror, where once she had seen a kindly grandfather figure dispensing wisdom and gentle guidance, she now saw a master manipulator orchestrating outcomes with surgical precision. Every twinkle in his eye, every benevolent smile, every seemingly spontaneous piece of advice carried undertones of calculation that made her skin crawl. He was constantly watching, constantly evaluating, constantly adjusting his approach based on information that his targets weren't even aware they were providing. And Harry, dear, trusting Harry, responded to that manipulation with the exact combination of devotion and dependency that Dumbledore had spent years cultivating. She watched him hang on the headmaster's every word, seek approval for decisions both large and small, defer to Dumbledore's judgment on matters where his own instincts might have served him better. It was a masterclass in psychological conditioning, and she was witnessing it unfold with the terrible clarity that came from understanding the ultimate purpose behind every calculated gesture. The worst part was how much she wanted to tell him. Every time Harry mentioned his parents, every time he spoke with reverent gratitude about how Dumbledore had protected him, every time he dismissed his own instincts in favor of the headmaster's guidance, she felt the truth burning in her throat like acid. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he understood, wanted to lay out every detail of what she had witnessed, or wanted to destroy his faith in false heroes and replace it with the kind of angry clarity that might actually set him free. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she had figured out how to present the truth in a way that wouldn't destroy him entirely. Not until she had developed a plan for using that knowledge to actually improve his situation, rather than simply adding to his burden of pain and betrayal. The truth was a weapon, but like all weapons, it needed to be wielded with precision and purpose rather than desperation and rage. Meanwhile, her friendship with Harry and Ron was slowly being poisoned by the secrets she was keeping. Every lie she told, every half-truth she offered, but every moment of genuine concern she deflected with false reassurances drove another wedge between her authentic self and the performance she was maintaining for their benefit. She could see them both noticing the distance, the way she seemed to be holding herself apart from their easy camaraderie, the way conversations that should have been natural and spontaneous now felt stilted and careful. Ron, in his straightforward way, assumed that her strange mood was related to end-of-term stress or some obscure academic project that would resolve itself once exams were finished. But Harry's attention was more focused, more persistent. She caught him watching her sometimes with expressions that mixed concern with growing suspicion, but as if he was beginning to suspect that whatever had happened to her during those 3 missing days was more significant than she was willing to admit. The worst moments came when he tried to connect with her about their shared experiences, when he mentioned the time travel they had undertaken to save Sirius and Buckbeak, when he talked about the weight of secrets and the burden of knowledge that others couldn't understand. Those conversations were exercises in exquisite torture, because everything he said about the isolation and responsibility that came with dangerous knowledge was absolutely true. But she couldn't acknowledge that truth without revealing the nature of her own burden. She found herself developing an elaborate system of mental compartmentalization, or carefully separating her knowledge of 1981 from her interactions with 1994. During the day, she focused on maintaining the performance of normalcy, on keeping her friends safe and unaware, while she figured out how to weaponize the truth she had gained. But at night, alone in her dormitory bed with the curtains drawn tight around her four-poster, she allowed herself to remember every detail of what she had witnessed. James Potter's courage in the face of certain death, Lily Potter's fierce love for her baby son, Dumbledore's cold calculation as he orchestrated their murders, the systematic abuse that had been planned for Harry's childhood, the soul fragment that had been deliberately placed to corrupt his development, the web of manipulation and control that extended through every relationship Harry valued. All of it was real. But all of it was true. All of it was waiting for her to decide what to do with knowledge that could either save Harry Potter or destroy him entirely. The decision point was approaching. She could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. Soon she would have to choose between the safety of continued silence and the terrifying responsibility of revealing truths that would change everything. Soon she would have to decide whether Harry deserved to know what had really happened to his parents, regardless of how much that knowledge might hurt him. Soon she would have to choose between protecting her friend and setting him free. And she had no idea which choice would prove to be the greater act of love. Chapter 11. The Weight of Silence. The twisted remains of the Time Turner felt heavier with each passing day, as its broken mass of gold and crystal serving as a constant reminder of truths that burned like acid in Hermione's chest. She carried the ruined device in a protective pouch, wrapped in silk and cushioned with cotton batting, but nothing could shield her from the way its presence seemed to pulse against her consciousness like an infected wound. Every time she touched it, every time she felt its weight shift in her bag, she was transported back to that October night in 1981, watching Dumbledore orchestrate the destruction of everything she had once believed in. But the Time Turner had to be returned. McGonagall would be expecting it back before the end of term, and its continued absence would raise questions that Hermione couldn't afford to answer. The challenge lay in explaining the device's condition without revealing the true scope of what she had done with it. She found McGonagall in her office late one evening, grading final examinations with the kind of methodical precision that had made her legendary among both students and faculty. The professor looked up as Hermione knocked, her sharp eyes immediately cataloguing the younger witch's appearance with the kind of attention that missed very little. "Miss Granger," McGonagall said, setting down her quill with careful deliberation. "I was wondering when you would come to see me. The Time Turner, I assume." "Yes, Professor." Hermione's voice was steady, despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. She withdrew the protective pouch from her bag, feeling the weight of McGonagall's attention like a physical force as she placed it carefully on the desk. "I'm afraid there was an incident." McGonagall's expression sharpened immediately, her lips pressing into the thin line that usually preceded either detailed questioning or significant punishment. She opened the pouch with careful fingers, her breath catching audibly as she revealed the twisted metal and fractured crystal that had once been one of the Ministry's most precious magical devices. An incident. The words came out flat and cold, carrying the particular weight that meant someone was about to be in very serious trouble. "Miss Granger, this device is completely destroyed. The crystal has been shattered. The temporal mechanisms have been fused beyond any possibility of repair, and the magical resonance." She touched the ruined Time Turner with one finger and immediately pulled back as if she had been burned. "What did you do?" The question hung between them like a sword, sharp and unavoidable. Hermione had rehearsed her explanation dozens of times, crafting a story that contained enough truth to be believable while concealing the earth-shattering reality of what she had actually accomplished. "I was experimenting with extended temporal displacement," she said, which was technically accurate if woefully incomplete. "I thought I had calculated the stress tolerances correctly, but the device suffered a catastrophic failure during what should have been A routine 5-hour displacement. McGonagall's eyes narrowed. Or studying Hermione's face with the kind of attention that had made her one of the most effective teachers in Hogwarts' long history. Extended temporal displacement. Miss Granger, the guidelines for time-turner use are absolutely explicit about the maximum safe duration. 5 hours, no exceptions, no experimentation beyond approved parameters. I know, Hermione said, allowing genuine remorse to colour her voice while carefully avoiding any mention of the true scope of her violations. I thought I understood the principles well enough to push the boundaries safely. I was wrong, and I take full responsibility for the device's destruction. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, containing enough truth to satisfy McGonagall's immediate concerns while concealing the fact that Hermione had pushed those boundaries by a factor of more than 20,000. But even as she spoke, she could see the professor's mind working, cataloguing inconsistencies and gaps in the explanation that would require further investigation. Miss Granger, McGonagall said slowly, her voice carrying the particular weight that meant someone was about to receive life-altering consequences for their actions. This device was worth more than most wizarding families earn in a lifetime. Its destruction represents not just a financial loss, but the loss of irreplaceable magical knowledge. The Ministry will need to be informed. There will be an investigation, and you may very well face criminal charges for the willful destruction of regulated magical artifacts. The words should have terrified her. 6 months ago, the prospect of Ministry investigation and criminal charges would have sent her into a spiral of panic and despair. But the girl who had witnessed Dumbledore's orchestration of the Potter murders was no longer capable of being intimidated by bureaucratic threats. She had seen evil wearing the mask of institutional authority, had watched good people unknowingly participate in systematic abuse because they trusted the systems they served. The Ministry's displeasure was a small price to pay for the truth she had gained. I understand, she said simply, and McGonagall's expression shifted subtly as she registered something new in Hermione's demeanour, a kind of quiet steel that hadn't been there before, a willingness to accept consequences that suggested the destruction of the time-turner had been worth whatever price she would be required to pay. The meeting concluded with arrangements for formal reporting and the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a lengthy investigative process. But as Hermione left McGonagall's office, she felt lighter than she had in days. The physical burden of carrying the ruined device was gone, replaced by the much more manageable challenge of deflecting official curiosity while she figured out how to use the knowledge she had gained. The temporal scar had been her next discovery, found during long hours of research in the restricted section, while she tried to understand the full scope of what her journey might have accomplished. Hidden in an obscure treatise on temporal mechanics was a description of the phenomenon, fractures in the fabric of time that could be created by particularly violent temporal displacements, permanent marks that served as evidence of past time travel events. The mathematics involved were staggering in their complexity, but the basic principle was elegantly simple. Her journey backward through more than a decade of time had required such massive amounts of temporal energy that it had actually damaged the fabric of causality itself, creating a detectable scar that any sufficiently skilled investigator could potentially trace back to its source. More importantly, the temporal scar contained within its fractured structure a complete record of everything she had witnessed during her time in 1981. Every moment of Dumbledore's manipulation, every detail of his orchestration, every piece of evidence that could potentially expose the true nature of his role in the Potter murders, all of it was encoded within the temporal fracture like magical DNA, waiting for someone with the proper knowledge and tools to extract it. The discovery was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant that evidence of her unauthorized time travel would eventually be discoverable by anyone who knew how to look for it. Liberating because it meant that the truth about October 31st, 1981, was no longer trapped solely within her memory. It existed independently now, preserved in the very fabric of space and time, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring it to light. But the final push toward action came from Harry himself during one of their increasingly painful conversations about the past and the people they trusted. They were sitting by the lake on one of the last warm evenings of term, watching the giant squid surface occasionally near the shore while they discussed their plans for the summer holidays. The conversation had been pleasantly mundane until Harry mentioned the nightmares that had been plaguing him since the events with Sirius, dreams that mixed memories of his parents' deaths with newer fears about the dangers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "I keep dreaming about that night," he said quietly, his voice carrying the particular weight that meant he was sharing something difficult. Not just the obvious stuff, not just Voldemort killing them. I dream about what happened after, about how scared I must have been, how alone. Sometimes I dream that I'm crying for hours and no one comes, that I'm just abandoned in the wreckage until Hagrid finally shows up. Each word hit Hermione like a physical blow, because she knew with terrible certainty that Harry's nightmares weren't just dreams. They were memories, buried so deep in his infant consciousness that they only surfaced during sleep. She had watched it happen, had seen baby Harry crying alone in the ruins of his nursery, while Dumbledore manipulated the scene below, had witnessed the deliberate delay that had left an infant traumatized and abandoned while the headmaster arranged evidence to support his preferred narrative. "But then I remember that Dumbledore was protecting me," Harry continued, his voice gaining strength as he worked through the familiar logic that had sustained him for years. "Even when I was too young to understand, even when everything seemed hopeless, he was making sure I would be safe. The blood protection, the wards on Privet Drive, all of it designed to keep me alive until I was old enough to defend myself. The irony was so bitter, so perfectly designed to cause maximum psychological damage that Hermione had to bite down hard on her tongue to keep from screaming. Harry was finding comfort in the very manipulation that had destroyed his childhood, was expressing gratitude for the systematic abuse that had been carefully engineered to break his spirit. Dumbledore's conditioning was so complete, so thoroughly embedded in Harry's understanding of himself and his place in the world, that he couldn't even conceive of the possibility that his suffering had been deliberate. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if things had been different," Harry said, staring out across the lake with the kind of distant expression that suggested he was lost in possibilities that could never be realized. "If my parents had lived, if Voldemort had never come for us, if I had grown up knowing I was loved instead of learning I was a freak. But then I remember that all of that suffering made me who I am, and made me strong enough to face whatever's coming next." The words were like knives in her chest, each one precisely calibrated to demonstrate how thoroughly Dumbledore's psychological conditioning had taken hold. Harry wasn't just accepting his suffering, he was embracing it, finding meaning and purpose in the very trauma that had been deliberately inflicted upon him. The headmaster had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, creating a weapon so perfectly crafted that it would destroy itself willingly when the time came for ultimate sacrifice. "Harry," she began, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite suppress. "What if—" But she stopped herself before she could finish the question, before she could ask him to consider the possibility that his suffering hadn't been necessary, that his trauma hadn't been inevitable, nor that the man he trusted most in the world had been the architect of his pain, rather than its reluctant witness. The truth was on the tip of her tongue, desperate to be shared, but she forced it back down because she finally understood what her real responsibility was. She couldn't just tell Harry the truth. Truth without context was simply another form of cruelty, another way of adding to his burden without providing him with the tools he needed to actually improve his situation. If she was going to expose Dumbledore's manipulation, she needed to do it in a way that empowered Harry rather than simply devastating him, in a way that gave him agency and choice rather than just more trauma to process. That night, alone in her dormitory while her roommates slept peacefully around her, Hermione made her final decision. She would find a way to expose the truth about October 31st, 1981. But she would do it carefully, strategically, in a way that protected Harry while destroying the systems that had been designed to exploit him. The temporal scar would be her weapon, evidence that existed independently of her testimony, proof that could be verified by neutral parties, truth that couldn't be dismissed as the delusions of a traumatized teenager. But first, she needed to plant the seeds that would eventually grow into questions too large to ignore. She needed to guide Harry toward asking the right questions, needed to prepare him for revelations that would fundamentally alter his understanding of his own life, needed to ensure that when the truth finally emerged, it would set him free rather than simply adding to the weight of his pain. The war against Dumbledore's manipulation would be fought with patience and precision, with careful strategy rather than desperate revelation. And it would begin with teaching Harry Potter to question the very foundations of everything he had been taught to believe about love, sacrifice, and the greater good. Because the greatest good, Hermione had learned, was not the preservation of some abstract ideal. It was the liberation of innocent people from the systems designed to exploit their suffering for the benefit of those who claimed to protect them. The time for silence was ending. The time for justice was about to begin. Chapter 12. Seeds of Revolution. The last week of term passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of subtle inquiry and strategic misdirection, at each day bringing Hermione closer to the foundations of a campaign that would take years to reach fruition. She moved through the familiar rhythms of end-of-year activities, final examinations, dormitory packing, farewell conversations with classmates. But beneath the surface normalcy, she was laying groundwork for a revolution that no one else could see coming. Her research began in the library, conducted with the same methodical precision that had made her legendary among Hogwarts faculty, but focused now on questions that had never occurred to her before her journey into the past. She pulled every book, every journal, every historical account that made even passing reference to the events of October 31st, 1981, spreading them across her usual table in the restricted section, while she compiled what would eventually become a comprehensive analysis of the official narrative's inconsistencies. The gaps were everywhere, once she knew how to look for them. Witness testimonies that didn't align with established timelines, magical forensic reports that contained anomalies no one had thought to question, official statements from ministry officials that contradicted each other in subtle but significant ways. Individually, each discrepancy could be explained away as the natural confusion that followed traumatic events. Collectively, they painted a picture of systematic evidence manipulation that would have been obvious to anyone who approached the historical record with sufficient skepticism. But Hermione wasn't content to simply document the inconsistencies. She needed to ensure that others would eventually discover them as well, would begin asking the same questions that had driven her to risk everything for the truth. The challenge lay in seeding those questions without appearing to be their source, in creating a trail of inquiry that would seem to emerge naturally from careful scholarship rather than guided investigation. Harry provided the first opportunity, though he remained completely unaware of the role he was playing in her larger strategy. "Hermione," he said one afternoon, finding her surrounded by historical texts in their usual corner of the library. "What are you researching now? You've been buried in those books for days." She looked up from a particularly damning analysis of magical trace evidence, her expression carefully neutral despite the way her heart was racing. This was the moment she had been building toward, the first step in guiding him toward questions that would eventually shatter his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his own life. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," she said, which was true in the most technical sense. "About your parents, about that night. There are some things about the official accounts that don't quite add up, and I thought you might want to understand what really happened." Harry's attention sharpened immediately. his natural curiosity about his parents' deaths warring with the defensive instincts that had been carefully cultivated by years of adults, refusing to give him straight answers about anything that mattered. "What kind of things?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her with the kind of focused attention that suggested she had successfully captured his interest. Hermione chose her words carefully, laying out just enough information to intrigue him without revealing the earth-shattering scope of what she had actually discovered. She guided him through some of the more obvious inconsistencies in the timeline, helped him notice gaps in witness testimony that had never been adequately explained, pointed out magical forensic details that suggested the scene had been investigated with unusual care for a case that should have been straightforward. "It's probably nothing," she concluded, allowing doubt to color her voice in a way that virtually guaranteed he would continue thinking about what she had shown him. "Just academic curiosity about a historically significant event. But if you ever want to research it yourself, these are the books you should start with." She wrote down a carefully curated list of sources, emphasizing the texts that contained the most glaring inconsistencies, while avoiding anything that might lead him directly to the truth before he was ready to process it. Harry took the list with the kind of intense gratitude that made her chest tight with guilt and determination in equal measure. Over the following days, she watched him begin his own research, observed the way his natural intelligence started to identify the same patterns that had first triggered her own suspicions. She didn't guide the process beyond that initial nudge, didn't need to, because Harry Potter had been trained by 13 years of surviving in hostile environments to notice when adults were lying to him, and the official story of his parents' deaths contained enough lies to keep his analytical mind busy for months. Meanwhile, Hermione was pursuing other avenues of strategic revelation. Rita Skeeter received 3 anonymous letters over the course of the final week, each one typed on a different typewriter and mailed from different locations around Wizarding Britain. The letters contained just enough verifiable information to establish credibility, paired with tantalizing hints about deeper inconsistencies that would require significant investigative work to fully explore. The first letter focused on timeline discrepancies, pointing out gaps in the official record that could be verified through public documents. The second highlighted witness testimony contradictions, particularly regarding who had been present at Godric's Hollow and when they had arrived. The third, most daringly, suggested that certain key figures in the Wizarding government might have been more aware of the attack than they had publicly admitted. Hermione had no illusions about Rita Skeeter's journalistic integrity, but she understood the reporter's psychology well enough to predict how she would respond to information that could potentially embarrass powerful figures while advancing her own career. Skeeter would investigate, would ask questions, would eventually stumble across enough legitimate evidence to begin building a case that existed independently of anything Hermione might contribute. But the most important work was happening on a much more personal level, as in the daily interactions that would shape Harry's development over the years to come. "I've been thinking we should learn some more advanced defensive magic," she told Harry and Ron one evening, as they sat by the lake watching the sunset paint the castle in shades of gold and amber. Things they don't teach in regular defense classes. Combat magic, protection spells, techniques for detecting deception and manipulation. Ron's reaction was predictably enthusiastic. Any opportunity to learn magic that might be useful in actual fighting was guaranteed to capture his attention. But it was Harry's response that mattered most, the way his eyes sharpened with interest and something that looked almost like relief. "That's a good idea," he said quietly. "I keep feeling like the things they teach us in class aren't enough, like there are dangers coming that we're not being prepared for." The observation was more accurate than he could possibly know, but Hermione simply nodded and began outlining a study plan that would ensure Harry developed the skills he would eventually need to protect himself from threats that extended far beyond dark wizards and magical creatures. She would teach him to recognize psychological manipulation, to question authority figures who claimed to act in his best interests, to trust his own instincts even when everyone around him was telling him to defer to greater wisdom and experience. Most importantly, she began keeping detailed records of everything Dumbledore said and did, documenting patterns of manipulation that would become clear only when viewed across months or years of accumulated observation. Every cryptic comment, every strategic omission, every moment when the headmaster guided conversations away from uncomfortable questions, all of it went into a carefully coded journal that would eventually provide irrefutable evidence of systematic deception. But her most important creation was hidden in a place where no one would ever think to look for it. A complete record of her time travel experience, written in magical ink that would only become visible under specific conditions, and sealed within a protective charm that would preserve it indefinitely. The account contained every detail of what she had witnessed in 1981, every moment of Dumbledore's orchestration, every piece of evidence that could potentially expose the truth about the Potter murders. She couldn't use that information yet, wouldn't be able to use it until Harry was old enough and strong enough to process revelations that would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality. But the time would come when he needed to know, when the truth would be the only thing that could set him free from the web of manipulation that had been woven around his entire life. When that moment arrived, the evidence would be waiting for him, preserved in magical stasis until he was ready to claim it. The end-of-term feast should have been a celebration, a joyful conclusion to another year of learning and growth and magical discovery. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, surrounded by friends and classmates who were eagerly discussing summer plans and speculating about what adventures might await them in their fourth year. But she found herself watching the head table with eyes that had been forever changed by knowledge that no 17-year-old should have been forced to acquire. Dumbledore sat in the center of the faculty table, his blue eyes twinkling behind half-moon spectacles as he surveyed the assembled students with what appeared to be grandfatherly affection. To everyone else in the Great Hall, he was the embodiment of wisdom and benevolence, the beloved headmaster who had guided Hogwarts through its darkest hours and emerged as a beacon of hope for the wizarding world. But Hermione could see past the carefully constructed facade now, could recognize the calculating intelligence that measured every gesture and weighted every word for maximum psychological impact. She watched him observe the students, his future weapons and tools and sacrificial offerings, and felt something cold and implacable settling in her chest like permafrost. He was so confident, so secure in his web of manipulation and control. He had spent decades crafting the perfect narrative, positioning himself as the wise mentor whose guidance was essential for navigating the dangers of an uncertain world. Everyone trusted him. Everyone believed in him. Everyone assumed that his intentions were pure, that his methods were necessary, that his vision of the greater good was worth whatever sacrifices it might require. But Hermione knew better now. She had seen the truth behind the mask, had witnessed the systematic destruction of innocence and the deliberate engineering of suffering. She understood that Albus Dumbledore wasn't the hero of this story. He was its primary antagonist, a master manipulator who had perverted every virtue into a tool of oppression. The feast continued around her, filled with laughter and conversation, and the kind of innocent joy that she had once shared without reservation. But innocence was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had been changed by her journey into the past, transformed from a naive student into someone who understood the true nature of power and the ways it could be corrupted by those who claimed to wield it for noble purposes. As the evening wound down, and students began making their way back to their dormitories for the last time that year, Hermione remained in her seat, and watching as Dumbledore rose from the head table and began making his way through the great hall with that familiar combination of dignity and approachability that made him so effective at managing the perceptions of others. He paused to speak with students, offering words of encouragement and gentle advice that would be remembered and treasured long after they left Hogwarts. He was performing the role of beloved mentor with consummate skill, cementing the loyalty and affection that would serve him so well in the years to come when he needed those students to trust his judgment without question. But when his path brought him past the Gryffindor table, when his ancient eyes met Hermione's across the space between them, something flickered in his expression that made her blood run cold. For just an instant, yet she saw recognition there, not of her identity, but of her transformation. He could sense that something had changed, that the eager young student who had always hung on his every word had been replaced by someone who was no longer quite so susceptible to his influence. The moment passed so quickly that anyone else would have missed it entirely, but Hermione caught it, filed it away as further evidence of the kind of man she was truly dealing with. Dumbledore was dangerous precisely because he was so perceptive, so skilled at reading the hearts and minds of those around him. If she was going to oppose him successfully, she would need to be even more careful, even more strategic than she had originally planned. But she wasn't afraid. The girl who had once been intimidated by authority figures and overwhelmed by moral complexity had been forged in the fires of temporal displacement and terrible revelation into something harder, more determined, more willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the people she loved from those who would exploit their suffering for abstract ideals. As the last of the students filed out of the great hall, as the candles began to dim and the magical ceiling shifted toward the deep blue of late evening, Hermione finally rose from her seat and began making her way toward Gryffindor Tower. But her mind wasn't focused on packing or sleeping or any of the mundane concerns that should have occupied her thoughts on the last night of term. Instead, she was thinking about Harry Potter, dear, trusting, manipulated Harry, and the long campaign that lay ahead of her. She was thinking about the seeds she had planted, the evidence she had preserved, the skills she would need to develop if she was going to wage war against the most powerful wizard of their age. She was thinking about justice and truth, and the price that would eventually need to be paid for decades of systematic deception. "I'll find a way to free you from his plans, Harry," she whispered into the empty corridor, her voice carrying the weight of an oath that would define the rest of her life. "Somehow, some way, I'll make sure you understand what was done to you and why. I'll give you the choice that was stolen from you, the knowledge that can set you free." The castle around her slept peacefully, filled with students and teachers who believed in the fundamental goodness of their world and the people who governed it. But Hermione Granger walked those corridors with the terrible clarity of someone who had seen behind the curtain, who knew that monsters could wear the faces of heroes, and that sometimes the greatest evil came wrapped in claims of necessary sacrifice. The revolution had begun, though no one else knew it yet. In the coming years, the seeds she had planted would grow into questions too large to ignore, investigations too thorough to dismiss, and revelations too damaging to survive. The truth about October 31st, 1981, would emerge eventually, and when it did, it would bring down the carefully constructed mythology that had sustained one man's vision of the greater good. But tonight, and on this last evening of her third year, Hermione was content to walk through the sleeping castle and plan the war that would eventually set Harry Potter free from the web of manipulation that had been woven around him from the moment of his birth. The girl who had once believed in heroes was gone forever. In her place stood someone far more dangerous, a young woman who understood that sometimes the only way to save someone was to destroy everything they had been taught to trust. The revolution would be quiet, patient, and absolutely relentless, and it would succeed. Because love, real love, not the twisted sentiment that called itself love while engineering suffering, demanded nothing less than the complete liberation of those who had been made to suffer for someone else's vision of the greater good. What if Petunia Dursley left, Harry on the Weasleys' doorstep, at age 3, and Molly raised him as her 8th child? What if the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry until Dumbledore answered for what he had done to the boy? What if Hermione used a time-turner to go back to the night Harry's parents died and found Dumbledore already there, watching what if Minerva McGonagall quit Hogwarts at age 60 and raised Harry in a cottage in Scotland, far from Dumbledore's control. What if Sirius Black and Fleur Delacour arrived at the Dursleys on the same night, both determined to take Harry and never bring him back? What if Cedric Diggory survived the graveyard and testified that Dumbledore knew the tournament was a trap? What if Bill Weasley broke every ward Dumbledore had placed on Privet Drive and found dark magic that should never have been nearer to child? What if Hermione found a locked room in Hogwarts that contained every child Dumbledore had sacrificed before? Harry, what if Severus Snape took Harry the night Lily died and raised him in Spinner's End without telling a soul? What if Victor Crumb offered Harry asylum in Bulgaria after the Triwizard Tournament and Hermione helped him escape? What if Harry walked out of Hogwarts in front of the entire school at age 12 and Snape was the one who held the door open? What if Pansy Parkinson overheard Dumbledore's plan in the dungeons and warned Harry before it was too late? What if Lily Potter left a second letter, hidden in Gringotts, and it named every person Dumbledore told her to trust? What if Amelia Bones launched a full investigation into Dumbledore after Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire? What if the Hogwarts portraits came thrice alive during Harry's trial and every former headmaster testified against Dumbledore? What if Neville Longbottom's grandmother Augusta demanded Harry be placed with her after she learned what the Dursleys had done? What if Draco Malfoy switched sides at age 13 after watching Dumbledore send Harry into the Chamber of Secrets alone? What if Arthur Weasley found Dumbledore's name on a ministry surveillance order for Harry, filed the day after Lily and James died? What if the Goblin Nation declared Harry a protected ward of Gringotts and told Dumbledore he had no authority over the Potter vaults? What if Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry during a routine or a check on Privet Drive and reported the Dursleys to the ministry? What if Remus Lupin found Lily's diary in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, and every entry was about Dumbledore's demands? What if Madame Pomfrey documented every injury Harry arrived with each September and handed the file to the Wizengamot? What if Blaise Zabini and Hermione Granger formed a secret alliance in third year to get Harry out of Dumbledore's grip? What if Neville Longbottom was the boy who lived instead, and Harry grew up free until Dumbledore came looking for him at age 14? What if every Hogwarts student in Harry's year signed a petition against Dumbledore, and Luna Lovegood delivered it to the Daily Prophet? What if Fleur Delacour brought the French ministry's auras to Hogwarts after the third task and demanded Harry be released into her custody? What if Dobby smuggled Harry out of Privet Drive at age 6 and hid him in the Room of Requirement for 5 years before Hogwarts? What if Winky the House Elf testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch, Sr., knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along?